As more and more begin to know, the status quo has got to go. They're bound to say yes to a man named Dr. No, a man who makes the establishment panic. Grassroots are growing way too wild, too organic.
I'm curious. This is Mike Wallace with another television portrait from our gallery of colorful people. Throughout the United States, small pockets of intellectuals have become involved in a new and unusual philosophy which would seem to strike at the very roots of our society. The fountainhead of this philosophy is a novelist, Ayn Rand, whose two major works, The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged, have been bestsellers. We'll try to find out more about her revolutionary creed and about Miss Rand herself in just a moment.
All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. The House passes an $886 billion NDAA. So this was on Friday that the House passed its version of the 2024 National Defense Authorization Act. It passed in a vote of 219 to 210. And the vote fell along partisan lines due to amendments that were added by Republicans relating to social policies in the military. It was kind of strange watching the debate. It was like the culture wars being debated while they're making the NDAA. Because usually, this passes with very strong bipartisan support. But these Republican amendments cover things like abortion, transgender surgery, and diversity initiatives, all within the military. So only 4 Democrats voted in favor of the bill and 4 Republicans voted against it. The 4 Republicans who opposed the NDAA were Reps Thomas Massie from Kentucky, Eli Crane of Arizona, Andy Biggs of Arizona, and Ken Buck of Colorado. The Senate still needs to pass its version of the NDAA, and then the 2 chambers will negotiate the final version that will go to President Biden's desk. So this is usually a pretty long process, and now it might be even a little longer with these Republican amendments in the House version. It's going to set up a fight between the 2 chambers because the Senate is led by Democrats. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer and other Democrats, are not going to want these amendments in there. So again, this is the NDAA. This is the annual military spending bill. And it's $886 billion, which is what President Biden asked for. That was his request. And now, as I've gone over before, if you want to look at the true total of military spending or spending on, national security or the empire, whatever you want to call it, adding other things like the Veteran Affairs Department and the Homeland Security and all sorts of other things, interest on debt, it's the true total is about $1.5 trillion when you factor those things in. All right, the next one here, bipartisan bill would prevent any president from leaving NATO. So this article is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. And this is a bill that was introduced in the Senate. A group of senators have reintroduced legislation to prevent an American president from withdrawing from the NATO alliance. A version of the bill failed to pass the legislature during the Trump administration. So Senators Tim Kaine, he's a Democrat from Virginia, and Marco Rubio, Republican from Florida, they're both members of the Foreign Relations Committee. They introduced this bill, and it had several co-sponsors as well. So this is, you have these senators that, they don't want Congress voting, to go to war or anything. They don't want to worry about that. They want Congress to prevent, the president from leaving this huge entangling military alliance. U.S. intelligence official says that the Ukraine war is a stalemate. So this is interesting. A senior Defense Intelligence Agency official has described the war in Ukraine as a stalemate and said that none of the weapons the U.S. and NATO are providing will help Ukrainian forces break through in their counteroffensive. So this is the DIA Chief of Staff, John Kirchhofer. He said this at a conference this past Thursday. I just saw it on Sunday. But he said, quote, certainly we are at a bit of a stalemate. One of the things that the Russian leadership believes is that they can outlast the support of the West, end quote. He listed some of the weapons that NATO recently began providing, including American cluster bombs and British Storm Shadow missiles. He said, quote, none of these, unfortunately, are the holy grail that Ukrainians are looking for that will allow them to break through, end quote. Putin says that Russia can use cluster bombs in a tit-for-tat response. So Putin said Sunday that Russia has a sufficient supply of cluster munitions to use if Ukraine employs the controversial weapons. The U.S. has started shipping cluster bombs to Ukraine, even though the weapons are notorious for killing and maiming civilians, and U.S. cluster munitions have already arrived in Ukraine. I haven't seen any reports yet that they've been in use. So we know, Human Rights Watch has said that both sides have used cluster bombs in the war, and there's other groups and evidence of cluster bomb use on both sides. Although Putin is claiming that Russia hasn't used them. And just from what I've seen, it doesn't it seems like they have used them, but not at the scale that they might now, that Ukraine is planning to with all this artillery. The U.S., South Korea, and Japan hold joint military exercises after North Korea test fired an ICBM. So this is another one from the Libertarian Institute. This is from this is from Connor Freeman. So Washington, Seoul, and Tokyo held joint naval drills testing missile defense in international waters between Japan and South Korea on Sunday, following Pyongyang's latest intercontinental ballistic missile launch. This is interesting. An envoy from North Korea spoke before the UN Security Council. I think that was on Friday. He defended his government's actions as a response to various military provocations by Washington and its allies. It's pretty rare that the North Korean official would do that, defend these missile tests. So South Korea's Navy portrayed Sunday's drills as an opportunity to improve security cooperation with Japan, as well as the United States in the face of North Korea's nuclear and missile threats. So this is another thing. South Korea and Japan, the U.S. Biden administration has been trying to foster more cooperation there. And, of course, historically, they have a lot of, animosity between them. And they've been kind of trying to get them to cooperate more militarily. And I think it's been successful. They've signed some deals. And so to see them doing joint drills, this is, again, not just a message to North Korea, but also to China. All of this is kind of really about China, the U.S. giving Yoon, the South Korean president, basically whatever he wants. So, it's an excuse for the U.S. to build up on the Korean Peninsula, which is very close to China. And, coming soon, we're not sure exactly when it's going to happen. The U.S. is sending a nuclear-armed submarine to dock in South Korea, which is just a provocation for the sake of provocations. And, who knows what North Korea is going to do in response to that? We don't know. They keep saying that, they're probably going to do, another nuclear weapons test. And basically they're just going to, make that come true if they keep up with these provocations.
You're listening to Part of the Problem on the Gas Digital Network.
You can apply your libertarian views in many different ways. If you believe in liberty, well, we believe in liberty across the board, but that doesn't mean that you can't, talk about one specific issue and focus on what the libertarian take on that issue would be. But that can also lead you into areas where you miss the big picture. And I kind of think that's what's going on here. We've talked a lot about this, where you'd see libertarians, let's say during the height of COVID, whether it was whatever it was, let's say it was during the height of like vaccine mandates during COVID. And you'd have someone like Ron DeSantis in Florida, and he would have a bill that says it's illegal for private businesses to have their own mandates, whether mask mandates or vaccine mandates or something like that. And you'd see a lot of libertarians who are writing pieces attacking him and going, hey, this is not a libertarian solution. And it is authoritarian for you to tell a private business that they can't have whatever rules they want to on their private property. And that is technically correct. It is correct. You from the libertarian perspective, it's tough to argue against that. Like, that's just right. However, at the same time as you have that, you would have libertarians like at the Cato Institute, not Reason, but another kind of similar organization, who would be putting out these pieces like the libertarian case for vaccine mandates. And that was stupid. Okay, the argument there was like something along the lines of, well, it's less of an infringement on liberty than mask mandates, which I don't agree with, but this is the argument. It's less of an infringement on liberty than lockdowns. It's less of an infringement on liberty than mask mandates. So the libertarian who supports maximum liberty and minimal, blah, 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 they can deal with this. And that's stupid. That was like a really bad take. It's like, the libertarian case for stabbing. Well, it's better than shooting, that's just ridiculous. But so we had a lot of that stuff coming out. But that aside, say the libertarian case for why DeSantis's bans on private mandates are wrong is actually a fairly strong libertarian argument. You can argue pretty strongly that on people's private property, they should be able to do what they want to do. However, the reason why something like that would get a bad response from a lot of people, not just libertarians, but a lot of people, is not because technically it's not correct. It's because it's more like, what are you doing here when you're writing this piece, especially if you haven't focused on the bigger issue? Like, if you really care about liberty, are you talking at all about the fact that in all of these other states, there are government enforced mandates in the opposite direction? Now, if you have, and you're railing against Fauci and lockdowns and vaccine passports and vaccine mandates, and then you also go, and by the way, I don't think DeSantis needs to go this far. I think this is wrong. Then okay. But there were so many people who would focus all their energy on just the response. And then you sit there and you go, okay, well, now you're almost like weaponizing libertarianism to be this thing where if there's a huge crackdown on liberty, you're going to respond to the reaction to that crackdown and judge them on whether they have a perfect score or not, rather than focusing on the huge crackdown to liberty. Daniel McAdams, who is, of course, Ron Paul's co-host on the Liberty Report, he has this rule. He said the libertarian rule is never do the bidding of the CIA. Like never. Now, I don't know that it's a complete law of libertarian physics. There are exceptions to it. Like if someone, I don't
needs to be waterboarded. Like just you have to do it.
Yeah, sometimes. Well, I say if someone asks me, do you think Vladimir Putin is a good guy who was justified in invading Ukraine? I will say no. No, I don't. I think he's a bad guy, and I think invading Ukraine was wrong. Now, okay, in a sense, that is kind of what the regime would like me to say. But okay, I don't think you have to take it that far. I don't think I have to say that Kim Jong-un is a good leader or something like that. But the point I believe that he's getting at is that it's like this. It's like if you're a libertarian in 2002, and in 2002, the war drums are beating for the war in Iraq. And, George W. Bush is coming out every day and making his case of how Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction and how we actually know that he was in bed with al-Qaeda and he was involved in the planning of 9/11. And he's trying to get these weapons of mass destruction that he really has into the hands of these terrorists that he's really allies with, and that they're going to try to detonate a bomb in, Mississippi or whatever the fucking propaganda at the time was, which, by the way, what I'm saying is not that far off. It was something like that. And let's say you're a libertarian writing at a libertarian publication. And let's say you just constantly are writing pieces about what a brutal dictator Saddam Hussein is and how he violates the natural rights of all of the people who live under his regime and how their regime would be so much better off if Saddam Hussein just wasn't there. Okay, that is technically true. That is accurate from a libertarian perspective. You're not actually wrong. However, for non-autistic libertarians who might actually be capable of zooming out and looking at the bigger picture, you might ask yourself, what the fuck are you doing right now? Like, why is this what you're focusing on? How is it possible that you think this is the most important thing for a libertarian to say right now when you see what's going on? And it would make people think that you are naive at best and a tool of the regime at worst, if that makes sense. And I think that's a big part of what's going on here. I think that's a big part of why people are having such a knee-jerk reaction against this video. I really do not believe that it is that so many people so sincerely believe that Wi-Fi is causing these negative health externalities. I don't think that's what's going on here. I think it's that people see someone fighting against this most corrupt regime, and then they see everyone in the establishment trying to just fucking discard this guy without being willing to take on his arguments, without being willing to sit down mano a mano with him and actually let's see what his response to this would be. Point. And then their response is, so you think Saddam's great? So you must be a Saddam Hussein apologist. And you're like, dude, what the fuck? Are you actually missing the bigger picture here? I don't know what the deal with all these vaccines is. That's how most people feel. We don't know. We're questioning everything these days, but we don't know. But the point is that he's talking about how corrupt this system is. And for some reason, you can figure that out. I'm not going to tell you what it is. But publications like Reason and Cato never seem to have the level of disdain for Anthony Fauci that they have for RFK. Now, why the fuck is that? Because don't sit here and tell me that Anthony Fauci hasn't pushed as much misinformation as you could accuse RFK of pushing at worst. And who had a bigger impact? Like, who really fucking, whose misinformation affected more people's lives? Soft on the alt-right, to this day, there are people who still say this. And it's like, it's not that they're wrong, technically. In the same sense that it's not like you're technically wrong if you said Saddam Hussein is an authoritarian. It's just that I'm going to focus my energy on George W. Bush trying to launch this war in Iraq, because I think that's more of actually the issue of the thing we should be against.
Right now, things were accelerated a little bit over there in this ongoing war, which was supposed to last a couple months. Yeah. And we suggested at that time, we'll be lucky if we can get out of there in a couple years. And it was the same old stuff that we went through so often under Bush. But it goes to show that whether you have a Democrat president or a Republican president, and even though they're fighting tooth and nail in the Congress, it's still the wars go on. The wars go on. And even though they're still fighting over that budget, my guess is that the military budget is not going to have to suffer from any cuts, and this nonsense is going to continue. Well, that's what I see this happening today. The article we picked from Zero Hedge was Russia terminates Black Sea grain deal. You mean they have economic policies involved in these war policy. Wheat prices spike as extent of Crimea bridge terrorist attack revealed. They attacked the bridge again. So this is deadly, and it's a pretty important bridge. It's between Crimea and Russia, so that's a significant bridge. But it hasn't been blown up, and I think last time they repaired it rather quickly, and they'll probably get this repaired. And I think there's not a whole lot of argument on who did this one. You know, it was probably Ukraine in a way, part of NATO, yes, a part of the United States, because it's probably our weapons and our support for it that did that. But then again, they also would like to work deals on. They had a UN agreement that was about to expire where the Ukrainians could get some grain out, which if you had some common sense, that shouldn't be too difficult to agree to. But anyway, that got canceled, and rightfully so. If your enemy blows up your bridge and you're pretending to help them out by letting the grain go through their territory, that they become annoyed. So I think the big point here is that war so often involved a lot of economic harm and difficulties, and this one especially. Two big items. Gas, blowing up the gas line was a big deal, and now they had made an attempt to keep the grain flowing for humanitarian reasons, for the help of the Ukrainians, and Russia participating in it. But that all sort of got canceled last night, and Russia got out of that deal. So it remains to be seen how soon the Ukrainian wheat will flow. But heck, we could sort of watch the price of a loaf of bread and see if wheat prices go up.
Well, I think the question people would have would be, why would they attack the bridge? Now, they didn't take it out completely. It's obviously going to need some repairs. Who knows how long it'll take? So why would they do it and be so proud about it? Well, the counteroffensive has, to this point at least, failed. Unless something major happens, they've run out of ammunition. I was looking at a report that I think 30% of the Bradley fighting vehicles that were delivered for it are out of commission. I think I think the Washington Post or New York Times or something reported 20% of all the material sent to them since the counteroffensive was launched a month ago are out. They've lost approximately 20,000 men in arms from this, so it's not going well. They're losing the equipment, they're losing the military might that they need. The only deaths, thankfully, there wasn't a lot of civilian deaths, but it was one family. They were going on vacation, a husband, a wife, and a 14-year-old daughter. Both of the parents were killed in this attack. There's some gruesome video that I do not suggest anyone look at right after the attack was made. But sadly, the girl did survive, but she's in the hospital now. So you have if there are legitimate military targets, of course, but you do have a family that's been destroyed because of that. And here's what the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, here's what they commented on the murder of this family. They said, the number of potential domestic summer tourist destinations for Russians is falling with alarming regularity. And so they're actually making a joke out of the fact that they killed a family on the way to vacation. And you'd say this is a spoof account. No, this is the official page of the Ministry of Defense. I would say at the least, Dr. Paul, that's in bad taste. That's trolling, and this is war. All sides do it, but I found that to be in particular bad taste. So we'll keep an eye on what this means and what happens. What will the escalation be? Last time they hit the bridge, the Russians launched the biggest volley of missiles that they had to that point. What will they do now? Will there be a lot of pressure on Putin to react strongly? Because the pressure comes from him not to settle down, but to get even more aggressive. So I think in the next few days it'll be very interesting to see.
It's going to be reflected in the Republican primary races because there are more of the Republicans speaking out and taking a position closer to ours. And at the same time, there's still the control of the money, and it's still the military-industrial complex. And there are disagreement among the many candidates for president. And of course, sometimes you look back and you think of what Biden is saying and compared him to some of the things the Republicans have said.
Yeah.
I bet you could get a pretty good list of where they were together on most of this stuff.
No, I'm glad you brought that up, actually. I don't know if you watched any of that Blaze TV summit over the weekend that Tucker Carlson hosted. I watched some of it, and of course on Twitter it went crazy because he had Mike Pence on. And Tucker being great, he said, we're spending all these billions of dollars in Ukraine, and we're going to send more and more, and you want to send more and more. Yet look at American cities, they're really a disaster. And Pence said, that's not my concern. So, and it really, whether he misspoke or whatever the case was, the perception was that Mike Pence doesn't care about America, he only cares about war in Ukraine. And Nikki Haley similarly was put on her back heels by Tucker, and Tim Scott was made to look extremely foolish. So it was pretty interesting to watch that. It was pretty well done.
Well, he signaled incredible weakness, especially after that disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan. And all along the way, the Biden administration has been slow in providing military support. Make no mistake about this. We promised them 33 Abrams tanks in January. I heard again 2 weeks ago in Ukraine, they still don't have them. We've been telling them we'll train their F-16 pilots, but now they're saying maybe January we'll let somebody transfer some jets.
I'm sorry, Mr. Vice President, I know you're running for president. You are distressed that the Ukrainians don't have enough American tanks. Every city in the United States has become much worse over the past 3 years. Yeah. Drive around. There's not one city that's gotten better in the United States. Okay. And it's visible. Our economy has degraded. The suicide rate has jumped. Public filth and disorder and crime have exponentially increased. Right. And yet, your concern is that the Ukrainians, a country most people can't find on a map, who've received tens of billions of U.S. tax dollars, don't have enough tanks. Right. I think it's a fair question to ask, where's the concern for the United States in that?
Well, it's not my concern.
Move on, because this is interesting, and you wrote about it this week too, but it really is worth a mention. It happened on, of course, was it Friday or Thursday? Put up that next clip. And it caught our attention for sure. Biden order activates 3,000 reservists for Europe deployments. You might say, well, 3,000, that's big deal, whatever. But they mobilized 3,000 U.S. military reservists, and they're sending them in support of the operation in Ukraine. Now, they're not going to Ukraine that we know of, but they're part of that operation. So I don't know what it says. What do you think?
Well, this is something that when you look at it, you say, well, why are we doing this? Why? My first reaction was that it's not going to help their enlistments. Yeah. And that's they're living in a practical world, getting more grunts to go out there and expose their lives. But that didn't happen so much, and this will actually decrease the enlistment, because I remember so clearly, and I'm sure you do too, about all the family tragedies of the Mideast wars that went on for 10, 15 years, and it was always relying on reservists and the State Guard and all these things that shouldn't be over there. They probably even had the Coast Guard over there, protecting our coast. Yeah. So that to me is not a help for people to enlist, which is good news for us because people become more attuned to this. But it's the other thing, though. It brings up the bigger subject that we deal with, in the article, and what I've done for years is, should there be a draft? Yeah. We had a big fight in the 70s. The draft was canceled, but then when they were bringing back registration, there was a big argument on the floor on registration, and I always took our position on that. And the position, I always wondered why would you? Why do you have to register? Because I've heard too many stories that they had all our names and all our dates, and they knew exactly where we were because they'd come find, you didn't register, for the draft. And back then it was conservatives for registration in the draft. And I had one very, very liberal Democrat come up to me who was against the draft. He said, "You had the greatest argument," because I said, "How come you're against registering your gun, but you want to register your kids?"
Yeah, you're right. I mean, your take is absolutely correct. The military recruiting crisis is getting worse, and this is their military guy. I don't know him. I don't know his work, but it's just to point out that this isn't going any better, and it's almost like a double whammy, Dr. Paul, because you have all the woke stuff that turns people off. Maybe it's a triple or a quadruple whammy. I think that's turning a lot of people off, and we've talked about that. We have the fact that the poverty draft is not as acute as it has been in the past. At least we're living under the illusion that there's still some sort of economic, sense going on. But then you also have now you're going to start calling people up again? You're right. I mean, remember those stories? Some single mother, hey, I signed up to do my 1 weekend a month for some extra milk money or something, and now we're in Iraq for 10 years.
And they like the idea of defending the homeland.
Yeah,
we're rolling a fight if we're fighting up our homeland. Yeah. But they want to pick them up and march them overseas. But we recently had sent 20,000. This is another 3,000 that we're sent. But I was a little shocked that we have over 100,000 in Europe.
Wow.
And it'd be sure a blessing if we could just bring them home.
And now to our story. Down through history, various political and philosophical movements have sprung up, but most of them have died. Some, however, like democracy or communism, take hold and affect the entire world. Here in the United States, perhaps the most challenging and unusual new philosophy has been forged by a novelist, Ayn Rand. Miss Rand's point of view is still comparatively unknown in America, but if it ever did take hold, it would revolutionize our lives. And Ayn, to begin with, I wonder if I can ask you to capsulize, I know this is difficult, can I ask you to capsulize your philosophy? What is Randism?
First of all, I do not call it Randism, and I don't like that name. I call it objectivism.
All right.
Meaning a philosophy based on objective reality. Now let me explain it as briefly as I can. First, my philosophy is based on the concept that reality exists as an objective absolute, that man's mind, reason, is his means of perceiving it, and that man needs a rational morality. I am primarily the creator of a new code of morality, which has so far been believed impossible, namely a morality not based on faith. Not on faith, not on arbitrary whim, not on emotion, not on arbitrary edict, mystical or social, but on reason. A morality which can be proved by means of logic, which can be demonstrated to be true and necessary.
All right. All right.
Now, may I define what my morality is?
All right.
Because this is merely an introduction. My morality is based on man's life as a standard of value. And since man's mind is his basic means of survival, I hold that if man wants to live on Earth and to live as a human being, he has to hold reason as an absolute, by which I mean that he has to hold reason as his only guide to action, and that he must live by the independent judgment of his own mind, that his highest moral purpose is the achievement of his own happiness, and that he must not force other people, nor accept their right to force him, that each man must live as an end in himself and follow his own rational self-interest.
May I interrupt now?
You may.
Because you put this philosophy to work in your novel Atlas Shrugged.
That's right.
You demonstrate it in human terms in your novel Atlas Shrugged. And let me start by quoting from a review of this novel Atlas Shrugged that appeared in Newsweek. It said that you are out to destroy almost every edifice in the contemporary American way of life, our Judeo-Christian religion, our modified government-regulated capitalism, our rule by the majority will. Other reviews have said that you scorn churches and the concept of God. Are these accurate criticisms?
Yes, I agree with the facts, but not the estimate of this criticism. Namely, if I am challenging the base of all these institutions, I'm challenging the moral code of altruism, the precept that man's moral duty is to live for others, that man must sacrifice himself to others, which is the present-day morality.
What do you mean by sacrifice himself for others? Now we're getting to the point.
One moment. Since I'm challenging the base, I necessarily would challenge the institutions you named, which are a result of that morality.
All right.
Biden is calling up military reserves. Are your kids next? As a rule, U.S. war reporting since Vietnam has been mostly mainstream media cheerleading the mission rather than digging beyond government war propaganda. After all, it was images of American boys coming home in body bags shown on the 6 o'clock news across America that finally galvanized mainstream opposition to that war. The Pentagon learned its lesson by the first Gulf War and its severely restricted up-close media coverage. Only trusted journalists were able to report from the front lines. Most of the press corps wrote up stories based on U.S. military press releases from luxury hotels in Baghdad. By the time of Gulf War II, the Pentagon came up with the concept of embedding select journalists with the troops. This allowed the story to be framed by the Pentagon with the false impression that actual journalism was taking place. It felt authentic because the journalist was with the troops and close to the action, but the story presented what the Pentagon wanted to be presented. This is perhaps a long way of pointing out that U.S. mainstream media coverage of the war in Ukraine leaves a lot to be desired. Yes, sometimes the truth does slip out in publications like the New York Times, which reported last week that in just the first weeks of the Ukraine's counteroffensive, at least 20% of the weaponry and equipment donated by the U.S. and NATO has been destroyed. However, usually what the mainstream media serves up are Pentagon and neocon talking points. Russia is losing, they report. Russia has already lost, as Biden said recently. Most Americans don't go out of their way to listen to the actual experts like Colonel Doug Macgregor, who from the beginning has been telling a very different story. Thus, Americans continue to be fed propaganda. There's a funny thing about propaganda, though. Sometimes it comes face to face with contradictory reality and is shown to be nothing but a pack of lies. Take, for example, last week's shocking report that President Biden had signed an order to mobilize 3,000 U.S. military reservists for deployment to Europe in support of the 2014 Operation Atlantic Resolve. What is Atlantic Resolve? It was launched in the aftermath of the U.S.-backed coup in Ukraine and the ensuing unrest under the U.S.-installed puppet government. So if Russia is losing, or has already lost, as Biden said last week, why has it suddenly become necessary to call up U.S. reserve forces? Well, in the midst of one of the most serious U.S. military recruiting crises ever, it seems Washington does not have sufficient troops for its anti-Russia mission in Ukraine. So what is the mission, and why does it seem to be creeping toward sending more Americans close to the battle zone? No one in the administration seems interested in explaining it, and no one in the U.S. media or Congress seems interested in asking. We are on a very slippery slope, with Biden's neocons continuing to escalate in the face of massive Ukrainian losses and an apparent shortage of U.S. troops. Make no mistake, if the U.S.-NATO proxy war with Russia is not halted, the next step will be to look at the U.S. Selective Service. That means they are coming from your kids. How long before America wakes up and says no? Thanks for listening.
Russia pulls out of the Black Sea grain deal. So Russia announced Monday that it was suspending its participation in a deal that was signed last year to facilitate the export of grain from Ukraine's Black Sea ports. Another aspect of the deal was that the UN agreed to help remove obstacles to the export of Russian food and fertilizer, and Russia has said that not enough has been done in that regard. The Kremlin said that Moscow would only rejoin the initiative if more of its demands are met. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said, quote, "When the part of the Black Sea deal related to Russia is implemented, Russia will immediately return to the implementation of the deal," end quote. So U.S. and other Western sanctions technically have exemptions for Russian agricultural goods, but they do make overall shipping from Russia more difficult. And as we know in other cases, even when there's sanctions exemptions, I could still cause shortages and difficulties of the exempted goods, just because companies, international banks, they just don't want to deal with doing business and having to worry about sanctions. But one of Russia's demands is to reconnect the Russian Agricultural Bank to the SWIFT payment system. That's a state-owned bank that deals in, selling Russia's agricultural goods. So that was kicked off the SWIFT payment system, which is the U.S. Western-led messaging system for financial transactions. Russia said that its suspension of the deal means that it can no longer guarantee the security of ships carrying grain from Ukraine's Black Sea ports. The Russian Foreign Ministry said that the decision means that there's no security guarantees in that area, and they're discontinuing what they call maritime humanitarian corridors. Ukraine jails a senior Orthodox cleric. Russia demands release. This article is from Kyle Anzalone over at the Libertarian Institute. So a senior figure in the Ukrainian Orthodox Church was placed in a pre-trial detention. Cleric Metropolitan Pavlo is facing charges for voicing opinions deemed too pro-Russian. A Kiev court ordered Pavlo to jail on Saturday. The cleric's bail was nearly $900,000, and he can remain in pretrial detention for a month. The judge claimed that he violated a court order by contacting a witness in his trial. Pavlo said he did not know that the person was a witness. So he was placed under house arrest on April 1st. And again, this is over allegations that he's saying things that are pro-Russian or pro-invasion. And so he's part of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which has historic ties to Russia and Moscow. After the invasion, they cut ties with Russia. They denounced the invasion, but that wasn't enough for Ukraine. Zelensky's been leading this crackdown against this church. And then there's another Orthodox church inside Ukraine, which I believe is the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. So it's very similar name, but that one does not have the historic links to Russia. But this is just a big, they're arresting priests and seizing the churches and everything. So this is all part of the de-Russification campaign that Zelensky has launched. The U.S. general says that weapons stockpiles are dangerously low. So this is another one from Kyle at the Libertarian Institute. As Washington ships billions of dollars in arms to Kiev, a general is warning that American stockpiles are becoming dangerously low. The Defense Department official called for the weapons industry to increase production. So this is General James Hecker, He issued this warning during the Chief of Air Staff's Global Air and Space Conference, which was last week. He said, quote, "Now you add that we're giving a lot of munitions away to the Ukrainians, which I think is exactly what we need to do. But now we're getting dangerously low, and sometimes, in some cases, even too low, that we don't have enough," end quote. And this is, as these cluster bombs are being sent, the U.S. started sending the cluster bombs and defending the move. Biden said that they're running out of ammunition, that both Ukraine and the U.S. Blinken made the same argument. Sometimes I think part of this is kind of, they're saying this to, try to increase the production so it'll benefit all the arms makers, the arms industry. But it does seem like they are getting, really depleting their stockpiles by sending all this ammunition to Ukraine. And of course, it makes you wonder how sustainable all this is. So the Marshall Islands is seeking more compensation from the U.S. for the health and environmental damage caused by U.S. nuclear testing as part of negotiations to extend a deal that gives the U.S. military access to the Pacific Island nation. Between 1946 and 1958, the U.S. detonated 67 nuclear bombs on or above the Marshall Islands, including Castle Bravo, which was the largest ever nuclear weapons test conducted by the U.S. The U.S. agreed to give the Marshall Islands $150 million in the 1980s and insists that the funds were a final settlement for the issue, but the amount fell well short of what is needed to clean up all the radioactive debris. 67 nuclear bombs were tested, and that Castle Bravo one, they say, was 1,000 times more powerful than what they dropped on Japan. So, of course, 150 million, the people of the Marshall Islands look at that, as an insult. So Marshall Islands Foreign Minister Jack Ading, he testified before the Senate Committee on Energy and Natural Resources last week and called for more compensation from the U.S. to renew the agreement with his country, known as the Compact of Free Association, or COFA. So the U.S. has these COFA agreements with the Marshall Islands, Micronesia, and Palau, and renewing them is key to the U.S. strategy against China because it not only gives the U.S. military access to the Pacific Island nations, but it allows the U.S. to deny other militaries access to the area. So Joseph Yun, who's the U.S. envoy to negotiate these agreements, has said that the U.S. reached a deal with Micronesia and Palau, but the Marshall Islands is still holding out. The U.S. has offered the Marshall Islands $2.3 billion in assistance over 20 years and a $700 million trust fund. So that is what the deal is, these agreements. The U.S. is also giving billions to Micronesia and Palau. It's basically the exchange. They give them aid in exchange for military access. And again, the big thing is that it's not just military access. It's also, they can also deny China's military to access the area. But the Marshall Islands foreign minister says that his country is seeking more compensation for the nuclear testing and detailed some of the horrors that the Marshallese have faced due to U.S. nuclear tests. So this is, there's a lot to get into when you talk about U.S. nuclear weapons testing on the Marshall Islands. It's a really dark chapter in U.S. history. And, the big one is this Castle Bravo test. This took place in 1954. And Ading said that U.S. military officials, quote, learned that a change in wind patterns threatened to bring fallout to inhabited atolls that had not been evacuated. They went ahead with the test anyway without warning the islanders, who were blanketed in radioactive fallout and had no idea what it was or that it was dangerous, end quote. So one of these atolls that was covered in radioactive fallout, he said that as a result, 70% of the children that lived there under 10 developed thyroid cancer, and many women of several of the affected atolls later gave birth to babies who resembled jellyfish and peeled grapes. So really bad birth defects, and they're still dealing with these health effects today. So one of these atolls, the Ronglap atoll, that this nuclear fallout fell on them. It was basically ash falling on them. They didn't know what it was. They were evacuated by the U.S. a few days after the test, but they returned 3 years later, even though the U.S. told them that they could go back, even though they knew it was heavily contaminated. And the reason why they did that is because the U.S. wanted to see what the impact of all this radiation would be on these people. So they used them as guinea pigs. Again, it's really shocking stuff if you don't know anything about it. And there's a quote from a guy named Merrill Eisenbud, who was a U.S. atomic energy official at the time. This came out, I'm not sure when this came out, but years after he said it. It was a secret document. And he said that it would be interesting to see how the radiation affected the people of this atoll. He said, quote, it would be very interesting to go back and get good environmental data so as to get a measure of the human uptake when people living in a contaminated environment. Now, data of this type has never been available. While it is true that these people do not live the way Westerners do, civilized people, it is nevertheless also true that they are more like us than the mice, end quote. So,
you run your mouth and I run my business, brother. You tell everybody I'm busted. You talk so much, you got me disgusted. But you run your mouth and I run my business, brother.
Chris Christie has said that he wants to fight Donald Trump, and rich people have to stop teasing fights. Like, if you guys are saying you got to fight, you got to start fighting. And the problem with people like at the level of Chris Christie and Donald Trump is they think that they're badasses, but they've probably never been in a fight their whole life. I'm sure they've had people killed. There's no question to me Chris Christie has had people killed. I bet someone shows up late with a seamless delivery. He's just throwing them off a bridge. I bet that's why he closed the George Washington Bridge the last time, was because he needed to get all the bodies of the people that were late with the seamless orders that he decided to throw off a bridge. You got to stay in your lane. If you don't know how to fight, but you just know how to off people, like you're not a badass. Just threaten. You could say that you've got better mob connections for offing other people. And YouTube censors, yes, I'm proclaiming that both Donald Trump and Chris Christie have ties to the mob and have histories of offing people. And I don't have any evidence of that whatsoever. But, it's one of the Russian talking points that I got sent, so you know that it's factually accurate. All right, moving forward, there was a video of Joe Biden, and he was nibbling on a kid. Apparently, he forgot that he was in public. Did you guys see that one? I need Joe Biden to stay in this a little bit longer. Like, I need him to get through Porch Tour, because I got some good Joe Biden jokes that are working, and I worked them out. And I can't have them recall Joe Biden until I've, done this the whole tour and put it out as like an end of year thing. So if someone could just like keep Joe Biden away from kids for like 6 months longer, because apparently I don't know how he was able to contain that. The videos came out of him sniffing, licking, groping kids, grabbing, and then they realized, you know what it was? He was on international waters, and he thought that because he was like, there's no U.S. cameras here. He forgot the world that we live in now with like the internet and everything, and that even though you're abroad, that doesn't necessarily mean you're on Epstein's island. Like, he's so used to, if he's on vacation, that means he's in places like this where he's allowed to grope the kids. But in this case, there were TV cameras right there, and so he was caught nibbling on a youngling. But they're just going to keep him in office. That's the way it works. Kamala Harris, did you guys see that? Where she was finally made a coherent statement. Usually you don't know what the fuck she's talking about, but in this case, you actually were able to understand Kamala Harris. And she let us know that there's an issue with global warming, there's an issue with carbon, there's an issue with pollution, and the only way that we're going to be able to survive and continue as a country is if we start getting rid of some people. And it's amazing that usually they don't have to correct Kamala Harris because she just makes no sense, and so they don't have to issue corrections. But in this case, she actually said something that was coherent, and then they had to actually issue a statement and go, here was the speech, because I guess they're actually writing the gibberish for her. That's how dumb she is, that they not only does it sound like everything she's saying off script, but when she's going off script and she's talking about how much she loves school buses, maybe behind closed doors, all she's talking about is we have to get rid of people. So they keep writing her talking points about school buses. And then in this case, I guess she, she just made a casual blunder, actually made sense and revealed some of what their plans were. So they instantly issued a correction. So continuing with this, some RFK stuff. I am hoping that we move on to from the topic, because at some point, if it really does keep coming up, I'm going to have to sit down and really, get autistic about it, get into the weeds, read all the papers, do all the research, talk to more doctors, and we're done with the COVID stuff. I thought I wouldn't have to worry about science for the rest of my life. Like, here's an example of a topic I found more interesting. There was a story this past week that Anchor Brewery, a legendary brewery out in San Francisco, closed. And part of the storyline, as reported by the New York Post, was that it closed because the unions kept asking for more and more raises, and it got to a point that one of the original craft breweries in this country, because of what they were paying, and I'm sure other factors, they could no longer afford to remain in business. And there was an additional issue that amidst COVID, when they were ramping down, the union was going for more. I wonder how many businesses in the United States of America have been ruined by unions. That, to me, would be a fascinating story. Here's two fascinating stories in American business and infrastructure. You look at like General Motors, and at one point they used to own, I think it's Dago or whatever, they used to own all the auto part manufacturers. Government came around and it broke that up. Similar thing happened with Microsoft. They spent years, like, not that I'm pro Bill Gates in any capacity, but maybe he realized that you got to play the game dirty when they were trying to trust bust him. But like, government seems to come in and they'll break up big businesses saying, hey, you're boxing other people out. And then you turn around a couple years later and like the industry has totally surpassed them. And it's like, what might that corporation been able to accomplish and continue to have competed if the government didn't come in and try and break it up? Or you look at like General Motors, this one I know for sure. It's like the unions agreed to better deals from Toyota that gave Toyota a comparative advantage against General Motors because their labor costs in the United States were less. I believe I have that storyline right. I haven't read about that one in a while. But I just wonder, like, how many industries have been gutted. Look at the American education system and how many kids are just, well, not that I'm pro public school in any way, but I bet public schools would be better if there weren't all these cushy little pension fund jobs. They used to talk about in New York City, like, I think they called them rubber rooms, where basically teachers would get fired for doing like creepy shit for kids. And then instead of firing them because the unions were so good, they just wouldn't let them in classrooms because they didn't want them around kids, but the union wouldn't let them fire them. So they would just pay them to show up to work all day, sit in a room and just read the New York Post, which isn't a bad life. I should go do that. I mean, that's basically what I do with my day. I love reading the New York Post. Listening to some tunes and listening to the New York Post doesn't get any better than that. That's a fascinating storyline. How many, like, where would we be as a country? Like, how many jobs and industries have unions gutted while, claiming that they're protecting some workers and then not even realizing how many other people could have had jobs or continue to keep their jobs? Short-sighted. But no, everyone wants to get into science and stats and all the shit that makes me fucking bored and feel like I'm back in school. But, you know, we ended up, topic circled back around. We were talking about it again. And then sure enough, it's the circle of the internet. I'm reading the YouTube comments and people are saying that I must be working for Big Pharma, which if that's true, you know, where's that check? Let's get a working green screen. Let's get a producer over here. Let's get a high-end microphone. Where's that pharma money? I have a very specific issue here, which is I think that information, when it's honest and good, needs to be presented in a particular way. And when I don't see it being given in a particular way, where I can follow it and make an informed decision, I get annoyed by that because I'm interested in actual truth and information. And when information is not presented in that way, I think for all of us, all right, well, how are we ever going to be informed or have truth if so many people are accepting of bullshit? The same way you were sold by Fauci or other individuals were sold by Fauci and the CDC on the mRNA vaccines, and I was screaming, hey, they are giving you dishonest information. Here's the information that you would need to make an informed decision. I also look, at least the way that it's being presented by RFK and podcast, I've not read all of his books, and I go, this is not enough information to be making an informed decisions. So, person said, hey, Rob, hope you're having a great summer. I'm a big fan of yours and usually agree with your takes. You brought this up 3 times now, so I got to send an email. I've watched a lot of RFK, and I thought his vaccine stance was pretty clear. There you go. Once again, they're throwing at me, hey, what RFK's got to say is obvious. You're the dumbass here that you just can't get this. Here we go. The FDA should require the pharmaceutical companies to produce RCTs on childhood vaccines using an actual placebo like saline, not testing a new vaccine against an old vaccine and fraudulently referring to that old vaccine as a placebo. If you don't know the risk, you cannot do a risk-benefit calculation. So once again, it's the exact same question that I had before. If none of the vaccines have been tested in this way, wouldn't you be removing them all from market, or at least making a government recommendation not to take them, which to me would be getting rid of them. If the government formally made a suggestion that you should not be taking vaccines, my guess is your doctor then wouldn't recommend it, and that would probably change all the liability of it. So effectively, you'd be getting rid of it, right? So just to repeat, they were trying to say, hey, RFK's position is clear. They have not been properly tested, and so now I'm asking, so does that mean until they're properly tested, they should be removed from market, according to him? Which, once again, the fact that I even need to ask that question, doesn't that present that what he's saying is unclear?
Dealing with January 6th events, of course, that great insurrection where the Republic almost fell. We were literally a hair's breadth from falling because of President Trump. But apparently, so that is driving the speculation that they may actually try to jail him. Now, he went to his Truth Social to talk about what's going on. And in his usual bombastic way, which endears some, of course, and it irritates a lot of others, he actually made a very good and very accurate point. And I'm just going to read from what he wrote. He said, they illegally spied on my campaign. True. Attacked me with a totally fake dossier that was funded by Hillary Clinton's campaign with the DNC. True. Impeached me twice. I won. True. They failed on the Mueller witch hunt. No collusion. True. They failed on the Russia hoax. True. We just found that out. The 51 intelligence agents fraud. True. We found that out. The FBI Twitter files. True. We found that out. The DOJ Facebook censorship and every other scam imaginable. But on top of that, they have now effectively indicted me 3 times. The Department of Justice staffed and runs the DA's office in Manhattan, with a probable 4th coming from Atlanta. So having failed in all of those things, they are not deterred, Dr. Paul. They're still going after him. And I have to say, it's been said before, but the whole idea that a sitting president arrests and puts in jail his prime opposition, his prime opponent in a coming election, that is not something that you would expect in a normal democracy. It's something you would expect in some third world dictatorship. You know, it's been said many times that a grand jury could indict a ham sandwich. That means it's a terrible system. And I really agree with that. It's a terrible system because the opposition's not allowed to speak out. So they do indictment, but now indictments have become essentially guilt. It used to be that this was just to get somebody to study it, but no, it's very ruthless. And this is something that has been going on. But pretty soon they'll say, oh no, they can not only can indict a ham sandwich, they can indict Donald Trump at will. Just indict him. And now I think most people realize that ham sandwich was innocent. And now I think they're waking up to find out that some of this stuff is a farce. And if that is true,
And I think Trump sort of has to have some psychological protection because he probably figures, like you cited some of his defense. It sounds pretty reasonable. So he has to have some defense, and that is that truth is on his side on so many of these issues. You know, sometimes it takes a while for truth to seep out and the people change their minds on things. But 1948 was a famous year in Texas when LBJ stole an election. Oh, he couldn't have stolen an election. He became senator and he's president. He's a legitimate president. But when they go back now, they realize it. Then I get to thinking, you know, he got away with that. Nobody really believes it was a fair election. And, you know, in many ways, he got out of office in disgrace, and which was deserved. And so we never know what's going to happen. I don't think, we don't know what's going to happen with this next election, but a lot of people think that it's over the top. And to me, it's a contest between the people who have a little more respect for a higher law versus thinking that lies are important and truth is unachievable. And I think there's more people out there that know and understand what a higher law is. You shouldn't lie, cheat, and steal. Even though it's happening all the time, I think there's many that understand that. So I think it's over the top right now of what's going on. That's not to say it's 100% on one side versus the other side. But I'll tell you what, another indictment, somebody said there are going to be many, many more, and they're going to come out of Georgia and every place else. I think every time they do that, I think Trump probably, he picks up a couple $1 million. We know that. It really boosts his fundraising. So it is a really distorted situation.
Use the law as a weapon against him. But, you know, Julie Kelly, who we had on the show, and she's been great on the January 6th stuff. She's an investigative reporter with American Greatness, and I have a lot of respect for her. Well, this is from the Zero Hedge article that we were both reading this morning. And this is what she writes about it. It's pretty chilling, Dr. Paul. She says, Smith, and now that's the prosecutor, Smith knows this case is small potatoes compared to what he's about to inflict on Trump and several associates for January 6th. It's very likely Smith will use the classified docs prosecution as leverage to seek pretrial detention for Trump when the special counsel indicts Trump for the several January 6 related offenses, which could include seditious conspiracy. So they're going to use those classified documents as a pretense to put him in jail in the slammer while he awaits trial for all the other stuff they're piling on him. And it just raises the crazy specter, Dr. Paul, of poor old President Trump sitting there in his jail cell running for president. And I think you're right. I think if that's going to if that happens, I think it's going to bring a huge sympathy around Trump, and it's going to get people to think there's really something wrong, not only with Biden, but with everyone around him. I just think it's going to backfire. I don't know how you feel about it.
Well, that's what I think, absolutely. But I tell you what, there is going to be another option, which is the dangerous option, because there's going to be a few people who will get really fed up with this if they see Trump in handcuffs behind some bars. And that will be a declaration that is very, very dangerous. It would really challenge those of us who resist and try to prevent the use of force to bring about political changes. But that would excite a lot of people in a very negative way. So let's just hope that it's limited to people waking up and saying, well, yes, this has been a ripoff. This is an extreme abuse of justice, and do their argument and fighting out in a political election.
They sent Janet Yellen over there. Now, she's not had that great a success. She went over to China. Some people were saying that she was taking some psychedelic mushrooms over there. That might have helped, actually. It helped her out a little bit. But she went over to India to do the G20 summit. And she basically, as U.S. Government people tend to do, she went over there like a bull in a china shop. And she had all kinds of demands that the final communique has to condemn Russia and has to talk about supporting Ukraine until the end of time. And everyone better sign this up or you're really bad people. Well, she came face to face with the fact that the world has changed. And she didn't get them to line up behind her and sign the document. In fact, as you started the show pointing out, there was no final communique because the U.S., again, with its allies, of course, its lapdogs like the U.K., they came in expecting one outcome. And that outcome didn't happen. So things, I think, have changed quite a bit. And the G20 meeting has concluded without the statement of condemnation for Russia and full, complete support for Ukraine. And I think it was Forbes that reported 20% of everything that's been sent over there is gone. So it's being crushed. Instead, and this does remind me, Dr. Paul, of the COVID thing, the bumper stickers. Even though it's obvious that what they were saying, that have been saying, is wrong. Ukraine is winning. Wear your mask. Get your shot. Everything they've said is wrong. They can't back away and take a look at it. They have to continue with the bumper stickers. And that's what we're seeing here in NATO. And it's actually, I think you suggested it early, very disgusting that the U.S. is pushing them to put everything into the breach and have a lot more people slaughtered in what is obviously a lost cause.
You know, during the debates, the argument was that most annoyed me, that I really got perturbed about, was, yes, we have to stay. We have to say, yeah, you're right. It's not going well. We should have done it. We should have done this and that. But just think how many men have died? How many women died? How many wounded have there been? We can't quit now, or they will have died in vain.
Yeah.
Just think of the insanity of that. Oh, go out and do more of it. And then you'll have more people dying in vain. But that was one of the arguments. In a way, this is what they're doing in there. We had a strategy which was non-existent. We don't really know why we were there. And why did the American people sit silent and let them go in there? The information is available, and yet I don't think they learned it in the government schools on how some of these things have happened through history. But the argument that we have to continue, because although we may have made mistakes and they were very bad, but we have to have a cause. We can't figure out what it is, but we have to keep sending the troops in. Keep building the weapons. Maybe it's the building of the weapons that's a motivation more than the strategy of moving the world in the direction of peace and prosperity.
And now what is self-sacrifice?
Yes, what is self-sacrifice? You say that you do not like the altruism by which we live. You like a certain kind of Ayn Randist selfishness.
I would say that I don't like is too weak a word. I consider it evil. And self-sacrifice is the precept that man needs to serve others in order to justify his existence, that his moral duty is to serve others. That is what most people believe today.
Well, yes, we're taught to feel concerned for our fellow man, to feel responsible for his welfare, to feel that we are, as religious people might put it, children under God and responsible one for the other. Now, why do you rebel? What's wrong with this philosophy?
But that is what, in fact, makes man a sacrificial animal, that man must work for others, concern himself with others, or be responsible for them. That is the role of a sacrificial object. I say that man is entitled to his own happiness and that he must achieve it himself, but that he cannot demand that others give up their lives to make him happy. And nor should he wish to sacrifice himself for the happiness of others. I hold that man should have self-esteem.
And cannot man have self-esteem if he loves his fellow man? What's wrong with loving your fellow man? Christ, every important moral leader in man's history, has taught us that we should love one another. Why, then, is this kind of love, in your mind, immoral?
It is immoral if it is a love placed above oneself. It is more than immoral, it's impossible. Because when you are asked to love everybody indiscriminately, that is, to love people without any standard, to love them regardless of the fact of whether they have any value or virtue, you are asked to love nobody.
But in a sense, in your book, you talk about love as if it were a business deal of some kind. Isn't the essence of love that it is above self-interest?
Well, let me make it concrete for you. What would it mean to have love above self-interest? It would mean, for instance, that a husband would tell his wife, if he were moral, according to the conventional morality, that I am marrying you just for your own sake. I have no personal interest in it, but I am so unselfish that I am marrying you only for your own good.
Well, should husbands and wives
would
tally
any
up?
woman like that?
Should husbands and wives tally up at the end of the day and say, well, now, wait a minute. I love her if she's done enough for me today, or she loves me if I have properly performed my functions?
No, you misunderstood me. That is not how love should be treated. I agree with you that it should be treated like a business deal, but every business has to have its own terms and its own kind of currency. And in love, the currency is virtue. You love people not for what you do for them or what they do for you. You love them for the values, the virtues, which they have achieved in their own character. You don't love causelessly. You don't love everybody indiscriminately. You love only those who deserve it.
And then if a man is weak or a woman is weak, then he is beyond love?
He certainly does not deserve it. He certainly is beyond. He can always correct it. Man has free will. If a man wants love, he should correct his weaknesses or his flaws, and he may deserve it. But he cannot expect the unearned, neither in love nor in money, neither in matter nor spirit.
You have lived in our world, and you recognize the fallibility of human beings. There are very few of us, then, in this world, by your standards, who are worthy of love.
Unfortunately, yes, very few. But it is open to everybody to make themselves worthy of it, and that is all that my morality offers them.
If they will
a way to make themselves worthy of love, although that's not the primary motive.
U.S. wants Ukraine's counteroffensive to go harder. So the Washington Post reported on Tuesday that U.S. officials believe Ukraine should be launching large-scale assaults against Russia's defensive lines despite the risk of major losses. And the officials are also blaming Ukraine's tactics for the struggling counteroffensive. The report said that the pace of Ukraine's counteroffensive has generated concern in the West that the government of Zelensky may not deliver as powerful a blow as it could. So the main complaint from the US and other Western countries is that Ukraine is not using combined arms tactics, which integrates infantry, armored vehicles, and artillery. Instead, Ukraine is relying on artillery and sending small teams of engineers to clear minefields, which Ukrainian officials say that they're doing to prevent unnecessary losses. So the New York Times also reported that the U.S. was frustrated by Ukraine's caution. So I'll read you this excerpt from the New York Times report. It's really unbelievable stuff here. It says, quote, senior U.S. officials in recent weeks had privately expressed frustration that some Ukrainian commanders, exasperated at the slow pace of the initial assault and fearing increased casualties among their ranks, had reverted to old habits, decades of Soviet-style training in artillery barrages, rather than sticking with the Western tactics and pressing harder to breach the Russian defenses, end quote. According to the Post, U.S. officials are privately saying that Western jets will not make much of a difference due to Russia's extensive air defenses. So even if they get these F-16s, U.S. officials are saying it's not going to make much of a difference. And I put in a quote from John Kirchhofer, the chief of staff for the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency. He offered a very bleak assessment of Ukraine's prospects at a conference last week, saying that no weapon will be the holy grail to help Ukraine break through. Despite the situation on the ground for Ukrainian soldiers, the Biden administration is still pushing for more fighting and shows no interest in a ceasefire or diplomacy. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, insisted on Tuesday that the counteroffensive is not a failure. Milley said, quote, it is far from a failure in my view. I think that it's way too early to make that kind of call. I think there's a lot of fighting left to go, and I'll stay with what we've said before. This is going to be long. It's going to be hard. It's going to be bloody. So the Russian Defense Ministry said Tuesday that Russian forces launched retaliatory strikes in southern Ukraine in response to the bombing of the Crimean Bridge by Ukrainian forces. Russia said that the strikes were launched against targets in Odessa and Mykolaiv, and Ukrainian authorities reported that airstrikes did take place in those cities. Not airstrikes necessarily, they were drone strikes, the kamikaze drones and missile strikes. So the Russian Defense Ministry spokesman said in a statement, quote, last night the Russian armed forces delivered a multiple retaliatory strike by seaborne high-precision weapons against the sites where terrorist attacks were being plotted against the Russian Federation with the use of drone boats and against the place of their production at a ship repair plant in the area of the port of Odessa, end quote. So Ukrainian officials reported damage to homes and port infrastructure in Odessa and said that a major fire broke out in the area. According to TASS, the Russian military claimed that it destroyed 70,000 tons of fuel for Ukrainian military hardware. One from the Libertarian Institute, this is from Connor Freeman. Henry Kissinger meets with China's defense minister. So Kissinger, the 100-year-old former Secretary of State, made a trip to Beijing, which, I mean, he's 100 years old and he's flying to China. That's a long flight. Whatever you think of the guy, it's pretty amazing that he's still, able to do that. So he met with Li Shangfu, who is the Chinese defense minister that's under U.S. sanctions, and the Chinese will not accept a meeting between him and Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin until the U.S. lifts those sanctions, and the U.S. has refused to do so. So while the Biden administration says that they're all about talking with China, they're refusing, what I think is a very reasonable precondition. And when it comes to China, it's all about face, and to them, it's respect. It's showing that they don't respect their defense minister if they keep him under these sanctions. And they first sanctioned him in 2018 when he was in another position and he oversaw the purchase of Russian military equipment. I don't understand why the U.S. thinks it has the right to punish China for buying military equipment from Russia. I think it goes to show a lot of the hubris. But anyway, so back to this article from Connor. Li, the Chinese defense minister, said in a statement that the U.S.-China relationship has reached its lowest point since the establishment of diplomatic relations. He said that this is because some people in the United States did not meet China halfway. He warned against the rising tensions, and he stressed that the path of peaceful development that China is pursuing is what is a blessing for the world, as he put it. The Chinese military chief elaborated further, insisting that Washington should have correct strategic judgment, saying that the future of the world would be better if the countries were living in peace and developing together. In the same statement, Kissinger, who played a crucial diplomatic role during the Richard Nixon administration in establishing relations with Beijing under Mao Zedong, was described as a friend of China in this statement. Kissinger warned against the consequences of war between the U.S. and China, saying that they would be catastrophic. He implored that the two sides should urgently increase cooperation. He said, quote, the United States and China should eliminate misunderstandings, coexist peacefully, and avoid confrontation. History and practice have continuously proved that neither the United States nor China can afford to treat the other as an adversary. If the two countries go to war, it will not lead to any meaningful results for the two peoples, end quote. So it's interesting, when Kissinger is kind of sounds like the voice of reason. We know we're in trouble. He's known for his infamous role as Nixon's national security advisor, leading the secret bombing campaigns in Cambodia and Laos. And we know the consequences of that, as we've been talking about cluster munitions. But compared to the rest of the DC establishment, the blob, whatever you want to call it, when it comes to Russia and China, he sounded pretty reasonable, recently. And President Joe Biden invited Netanyahu during a phone call on Monday, and this comes as Tel Aviv is escalating its military attacks and bombings against neighboring countries, the blockaded Gaza Strip, as well as Palestinians living in the occupied West Bank. Relations between the White House and the Israelis appeared strained as a result of controversies related to the Netanyahu's coalition's planned judicial overhaul, which caused political chaos in Israel. There was a lot more protests on Tuesday. Biden and Netanyahu had not spoken for 7 months. Republican senators accused Biden of being anti-Semitic for this, but here they are on the phone and they have a nice call. During that time, the U.S. has still come out backing Israel. Even, during that big raid in Jenin, they said, basically came out in support, and, they're still supplying them with all this military aid. Hasn't been any real change to the relationship. Biden just hasn't spoken to Netanyahu.
Here's Gerald Salenti with today's trends in the news.
This office building bust is just beginning to make the news. I'll give you a few examples. Commercial real estate values are set to crater as much as 40% by 2025 in 6 cities. Oh, that's according to Capital Economics. Hybrid work trend may wipe out $800 billion from office property values by 2030. That's McKinsey's study. You ready for this one? Diversify or die. San Francisco's downtown is a wake-up call for other cities. This is an AP story that came out a couple of days ago. Jack Moganam, manager of Sam's Cable Club Lounge in downtown San Francisco, relishes the days when his bar stayed open past midnight, every night, welcoming crowds that jostled on the streets, bar hopped, window browsed, or just took in the night air. He had to drastically curtail those hours because of diminished foot traffic and business down 30%. China's going down. As I said, the 20th century was the American century, but the 21st century would be the Chinese century because the business of America has been war and the business of China business. But that's changed because China's the one that launched the COVID war on the Chinese Lunar New Year, the year of the rat in 2020, and had 3 years of zero COVID policy that destroyed the lives and livelihoods of hundreds of millions of people. Bottom line, the businesses that are gone don't come back. And then we put all the data in on the exports. And it's not only Chinese exports that are going down. They're going down in Vietnam. They're going down out of Taiwan. They're going down out of South Korea. And imports are going down. So now when you're looking at the market front, what's boosting it now, it's summertime and the living is easy. People aren't spending. The new numbers came out on retail. When you put inflation into it, they're actually negative. People are spending money on services, travel, tourism, that kind of stuff, going to restaurants. But when the summertime ends in the Northern Hemisphere, that's when you're going to see the markets going down. And that's when you're going to see reality set in from the high interest rates. The presidential reality show, Chris Christie calls it unlimited buffet of weapons for Ukraine. That slobby little fat boy that couldn't fight his way out of a paper bag comes out shooting his fat mouth off that he wants more weapons going to Ukraine. I want them to have every weapon they need to be able to win. And this is a proxy war. Oh, yeah, it's a proxy war. He admits we're at war with Russia. The job of a leader is not following the polls. What leader? This slob leading me? What are you kidding? And that's who you have all around the world. Arrogant jerks off in a country near you telling you what to do. Anybody that supports the Ukraine war, go over there and fight. Take your money. Take your family. Go over there and fight or shut your mouth. And again, people have no idea. I talk to people, the libtards. Oh, well, that Putin's a real villain. It's terrible what he's done. I said, do you have any idea of the overthrow of the democratically elected government of Viktor Yanukovych, as we wrote in detail in the Trends Journal by the United States, the coup of the Ukrainian government, the violation of the Minsk agreement, the promises that NATO wouldn't move money further. But now I don't even want to get into a discussion with them. It's a waste of time. It does not take a majority to prevail, but rather an irate, tireless minority keen on setting brush fires of freedom in the minds of Medicine Samuel Adams. And you are that irate, tireless minority. We have to unite. So do what you can to occupy peace, to support us. We're doing everything we can to support you. And then that guy, Pencilhead Pence, he said, I believe that it's the interest of the United States of America to continue to give Ukraine military the resources they need to repel Russian invasion. You're not going to repel the Russian invasion. They're going to win. And Pencilhead, you go over there and you go fight. Get a discussion with Tucker Carlson. Your concern is that the Ukrainians, the country most people can't find on the map, Carlson said, who have received tens of billions of U.S. tax dollars, don't have enough tanks? I think it's a fair question to ask. Like, where is the concern for the United States? It's not my concern, Pence replied. Tucker, I have heard that routine from you before. It's not my concern. Anybody that says we can't be the leader of the free world and solve our problems at home has a pretty small view of the greatest nation on earth. Solve our problems at home? Oh, another train just crashed. Some 40-something cars derailed over in Pennsylvania. The roads are rotting in front of us. Homeless, filling the streets. We got more homeless articles in this Trends Journal. People can't afford living paycheck to paycheck. And you got a clown like this saying this leader of the free world. What free world are you talking about? The free world over there in France? When you give Macron the finger, the president, you get fined, what? It was like 20,000 euros and get a year in jail for doing that. One after another. What free? It's not our business to be overseas. It's our business to protect America, to secure the homeland.
Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
Oddly enough, the negative reaction to Rippaverse and your work.
Yeah, well, this is the most mild thing that I've ever done, right? I've never done anything comparable, like as far as in recent years, like over the last decade, hot takes aside, like this is the most mild, apolitical thing that I've done. And I've got the most pushback doing this. Got more pushback doing this I did backwards, or even doing stuff with being libertarian, Blaze. Like none of that stuff compares to what we dealt with here. And I think that a lot of that is because of what this means, right? A lot of people, particularly the authoritarian left, have gotten off on being basically in control of all of entertainment sectors. So kind of like what Backwards did, it's a jolt in the industry, but it's also like a shakeup because people are like, well, wait a minute, we can't really control these guys. And, you know, we sat up there and definitely with the rise of the cancellation as an idea, definitely going in 2015 and beyond, where people will come for your jobs. They try to get you out of the jobs in the event that they didn't like something you said, whether it be then or whether it be years ago. And for us, and the setup is, well, they can't do anything. There's literally nothing they can do. They can't come from the distributor. We are the distributor. They can't come from the creatives. We are the creatives. They can't come from the boss. I'm the boss. So all of their screeching is really just, it's into a void. But also a big thing is, and I say this all the time, it's about the audience. They have for the last years with major brands basically insulted their audience, insulted customers. They rejected some or didn't like something. Longtime fans, they call them racist, misogynistic, all this other stuff. And what the Rippaverse is watching those arguments be blown up in real time. Oh, the fact that people, they would never support a black character. Well, there's like some. They don't like female characters, whether it's Yaira, right? All of this stuff that they tried to levy on people, which we always knew was false. The Rippaverse disproves it just by mere existence. And it's not anything that it absolutely tries to do. It's just by default. So you combine that with the fact that they can't control it, you're getting the reaction it is that we get. And I've had more nasty things said about me than I ever have in my entire life, but it doesn't really matter end of the day because there's nothing that they can do to stop us. Nothing. Absolutely nothing.
It's crazy. I mean, I'm thinking about what you're saying right now. I'm thinking to myself, if you guys are upset about this, you really should listen to his podcast. You have no idea. You're going to be begging to have Rippaverse back after you hear the other sides of Eric July. I mean, and as you say, there's nothing ideological about it.
No, that's true. Like everybody, for the most part, leaves the political stuff at the door. Rippaverse is creative because we focus on making good stories, focus on making good content for our audience. And yeah, like again, all the hot takes and stuff that I've said over the years, this comic book universe is the least politically charged thing that I have done ever, as far as seeing the creative success it is that I have. And they hate me for it. They hate me for it because for them, they understand how important it was and is for them to keep control of this. I mean, we're seeing a reaction to me being at San Diego Comic-Con, which is a place that they think I'm not supposed to be at. Why would they host a guy that basically is the #1 selling brand right now in independent comics? Why would an actual comic book conference have the guy that's the actual owner there? They don't like it. They just think that it's their space. It belongs to them. Even though none of these characters they created for the most part anyway, they just think it belongs to them. And what the Rippaverse is, it shows that there is an alternative sort of renaissance that is going to be in the creative space. That's going to be a thing. And there's not much they can do to stop it. So, you know, this is them being faced with that reality.
Cooperate in torture. That's part of what inspired Manning to leak the documents in the first place was then Bradley Manning was being made to participate in the booking of a guy who was guilty of nothing more than writing a newspaper article about the Prime Minister, and who was sure to be taken off to be tortured and maybe killed. That was why Manning decided to go first to the Post and the Times that rejected his leak, and then ultimately to WikiLeaks to tell that story. They also leaked, Manning also leaked these documents from the State Department where they talked about the siege in the Gaza Strip. And now the policy was to keep the Palestinians on a diet, hungry but not starving, they said. And that was revealed in the documents, as well as pressure by the Barack Obama administration and the Hillary Clinton State Department on the government of Spain to drop their war crimes investigations against George Bush, Donald Rumsfeld, Dick Cheney, and the principals who had lied us into the Iraq War. And hilariously, the Obama government said, "We're investigating, so you don't need to," and denied their universal jurisdiction there. And you should know this, because I don't know what you know about this, but it's very important, that CrowdStrike admitted that they had no evidence whatsoever that the Russians were the ones who had supposedly, quote unquote, exfiltrated that data from the DNC server. None. And in the Robert Mueller report, they claim no chain of custody to WikiLeaks, from whoever leaked it to WikiLeaks. In other words, every word that you have ever heard uttered about how it's some kind of known fact that Russia was behind that leak is just a lie. The whole thing was a hoax. And to this day, nobody knows who leaked it, other than Craig Murray. You saw in the video there, he told me on the show that he knows who leaked it. And it was no one that had anything to do with Russia whatsoever. That's believable compared to the lies about it. And then there's Vault 7, where they prove that the CIA is violating our rights, spying on us just as bad as the FBI and the National Security Agency, and on like that. But anyway, the real point here is, as you heard stipulated in the film, Assange is a publisher, a journalist. He is a leak-e, not a leaker. So he's never signed any confidentiality agreement, and he's not an American. So the only reason he's under American jurisdiction at all is simply because our government claims so, even though they have no real right to. But as long as they do claim power over him, then that makes him a U.S. person. And that means he's protected by the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, and that means that he has the right to publish whatever the hell he wants. It's as simple as that. The problem is this, though. Woodrow Wilson, hold your booze for time. Woodrow Wilson's Espionage Act is written so broadly that it can include us for sharing WikiLeaks in our emails with our friends. But the problem is, the thing about it is the Justice Department's never tried to push it that far. They've never prosecuted, or even really, I don't think successfully, or really tried to prosecute a leak-e for publishing this information, although they've gone very hard after leakers, especially in the Obama years. But so when they talk about in the movie where you saw people saying that this would set such an important precedent, there's no way to exaggerate that. If this guy was convicted in an American court of espionage and the Supreme Court would uphold it, there would be in American history the time before the case of U.S. versus Assange and the time after. And in the time after, it goes to show that the government can prosecute journalists for publishing secrets that they don't like. And so that is the biggest deal of all. It changed all of American history and where we're headed.
You have two things that make the United States outstanding. One is from sea to shining sea. The other is the Constitution, and particularly in the Constitution, the amendments 1 to 10, which constitute the Bill of Rights. In the beginning, number 1, the First Amendment, the government will make no laws. It's categorical. The destruction, the blighting, the truncating, the removal of the privilege of the, not the privilege, that's the wrong word, the removal of the right, the fundamental right of every American citizen to access opinion and to exchange opinion between themselves, and as a consequence of that, fulfill the necessity of knowledge in their families, within themselves, within your friends, and within your community, as a consequence, within the Congress, within the state Congresses and the federal Congress. Founded upon the exchange of knowledge made possible by the First Amendment. Every citizen, except of course those in Washington, D.C., in the air they breathe in and the air they breathe out contains the culture of the First Amendment. And now we see in the, what's that called again? The Twitter files, the Twit files, released by Matt Taibbi, the Stanford Observatory, dedicated, along with the Vitality Project and many others, to facilitating the FBI, the CIA, Homeland Security, CDC, HIH, all of them, to truncate and remove the capacity for people to read other people's tweets on Twitter. It's a bloody scandal so deep into the culture of the United States, and it's exemplified by applying 1917 Espionage Act to Julian Assange, who's simply a publisher and wasn't the first to publish, by the way, all of that information that so scandalizes these people. The cables published in their entirety by John Young, Krypton, Krypton.org, a website housed in New York. He's left alone. The partners, the original partners, turned on Julian, and then just recently in November realised what fools they were to turn on Julian, and released a letter signed by the publishers, Ken Salzberger, not the journalists, the publishers of the New York Times, the publishers of The Guardian, the publishers of Der Spiegel, the German newspaper, the publishers of Le Monde, the French newspaper, the publishers of El País, the Spanish newspaper. All of those original partners in the publication realised after all these 10 years that if Julian Assange is destroyed by the application of the Espionage Act, they are destroyed. The other day, Robert Kennedy, who you couldn't ask for a more convicted patriot to the United States, their family's been in the centre of it. You might disagree with this, that and the other, what he says, but that's the privilege of the First Amendment. He can write it and we can disagree with it. He released a tweet. Without a free press, there's no United States. Without a free Julian Assange, there's no free press. The first sentence, without a free press, there's no United States. What does it mean? What are you left with, citizens of the United States? What are you left with? Ask the question and answer it for yourself. If the free press is removed for you, what do you describe the United States as in those circumstances, if there's no free press? So I ask you humbly, or not humbly, modestly, to join with us and bring about the essential iconographic freedom of Julian Assange, which will bring about a renewal of the approach of the federal authorities to the to the rights in the Bill of Rights, 1 to 10, specifically, numero uno.
When Zuckerberg and his Meta, Facebook, came in and said, we're going to kill Twitter, we're going to do it with kindness, we're going to have a kinder, gentler Twitter, and so we opened up Threads. And a lot of people anticipated it, people who hate Elon Musk, and for some reason hate free speech, I don't know why. So after a couple of weeks, let's put it up now, this is why we're talking about it. Now this we saw on Zero Hedge. Meta's Threads bombs as daily active users halved. Now go to the next one, if you can, please. And this is a study. While a strong start makes Threads a contender among possible Twitter replacements, daily active users dropped from 49 million to 23.6 million in a week. Zero Hedge had a little fun with this. If you go to the next tweet, they said Threads usage drops by half from the initial surge. At this rate, it will need a bailout from the CIA. And now looking at it in graphic form, this is what the chart looks like. If we can do the next one, just to finish this part out of what we're discussing. Now that black line is Threads. And when it launched, there was a huge surge of interest that first couple of days. And indeed, it surpassed Twitter in terms of usage. But very, very quickly, interest in Threads plummeted. And you can see that black line. Well, Twitter has stayed relatively solid with a couple of increases in the thing. So it came in, and people were interested, and they weren't that interested.
I wonder what that does to the planned battle, physical battle between the two.
Oh my gosh,
and they say Zuck is training. It's training. So.
Wow, pay-per-view, I bet they'd make $1 billion.
Yeah, but that is weird. I used to dream of the days when I started thinking about war. Why don't we just have the two presidents of the country fight it out?
No, that's not nice, because poor old Biden versus Putin.
Oh, that's right. We'd be considered anti-American.
Abusing the seniors.
But I don't think our president is a good representation and example.
Maybe Kamala will do it.
Will?
Kamala and Putin can go at it.
There you go. So, but I guess the market is working, and it's swift.
Yeah.
That's a big point that I want to make, because economic factors can be that swift too. Things move very quickly. Matter of fact, I was watching a television one morning on 9/11 when, and I was watching the business station, and all of a sudden, the announcement came and the pictures there, and the sudden changes, stock markets closed and everything else. I mean, this is instantaneous. So the economic system has, they go fast and sometimes they're off and they have ups and downs, but sort of on the medium to long term, markets are pretty smart and they'll sort it out because everybody gets a vote and the consumer eventually decides which product is going to lack. And I think in this case, it'll be the consumer that's going to make the difference. And it may not only be for the service that they're getting, it might be the trust in protecting their information. It might be the privacy issue that will make the difference. And I would think, from my non-expertise on the subject, I would think people would expect more protection of their privacy from Twitter than they will from Zuckerberg.
I think this sort of the censorship genie is out of the bottle. And I think we learned from the Twitter files how much of a heavy hand these guys had on just literally determining what reality is. Because, for example, you talk about COVID. During COVID, if you disappear people like Dr. McCullough, you'll never know that there was that view out there. If you disappear people like Dr. Paul, who was talking about, the other Dr. Paul, who was talking about, well, what about natural immunity? If you just disappear what people can say, then that's never part of the debate. That's like that cartoon where, all the scientists agree, and then the one stands up and says, except me, and they shoot him. So I think what happened really is, and maybe I'm being too optimistic, is that people's perception changed and they said, you know what, now that I realize how censored everything was, maybe I don't want to go there. And so I think that may have been what crippled Threads from the very beginning. Well, again, this is anecdotal. I'm not pretending this is anything scientific. This person, Shaney Rich, got a notice from Thread. It said, your thread on Threads has been removed. We removed your post on Threads because it goes against our community guidelines. Well, what was it that he posted? He posted simply a piece of information. Breaking. It has been confirmed that the West Wing of the White House was evacuated due to cocaine being found. The FBI is scrambling to find out who it could belong to. That is simply a notice of fact. It was removed, and the reason why they said is that they had to prevent the count from being deleted. They had to remove the fact. And now the other one here is Ashley St. Clair, and she works for the Babylon Bee, which is a satire. It's a conservative libertarian satire site. Extremely good, extremely funny. And she posted this. She went to Threads and checked it out. She said, I posted a meme about Twitter being better than Threads, and they removed it after 1 minute for, quote, incitement to violence. And let's look at what she posted. This is a very, very well-known meme that's used over and over, and it's very, very funny. If we can go to that next one, here's what she put up, kind of as a joke. It's a satire site. So it's the guy drinking coffee, and it says, Twitter is better than Threads, changed my mind. And here's what she got after she posted. If you can do the next one. Your thread has been removed. Your post on Threads goes against our community guidelines on violence and incitement. Come on. And that's why I think, Dr. Paul, again, anecdotal, but if this happened over and over, the word gets out and people just say, you know what, I don't want to go there.
This idea came up, when we talked about legislation. I said, most of the time, Daniel, you'll know what the answer is by reading the title.
Yeah, easy. Saved us some time.
And it was easy. I was told it was easy for my employees because you could sort of anything that wasn't constitutional, I'm not interested in. Yeah. And other officers would say, you guys have it just too easy. You can we have to satisfy all the sponsors and all the supporters and donors.
Exactly. The $850 billion chicken comes home to roost is what Coburn titles it, and the subtitle says it all. The military-industrial complex is not designed to actually fight wars. If so, you wouldn't see Ukraine struggling right now to win one. Very heavy indictment, and he starts out, and we won't go into the detail, he starts talking about all the problems with the Bradley fighting vehicle. For years, for decades, 40 years, they fought over the fact that it wasn't very good at protecting the soldiers inside. They light up like matches when they were hit. And the point being that the military-industrial complex operates very, very much separately from the idea of winning wars or protecting the country.
He concludes, he says, the richest war machine in history, having scraped its cupboard bare, is now reduced to fielding a device of dubious military utility, deemed illegal by over 100 countries. That's what we get for $850. So there's the answer.
Yeah.
We're done. Our work is done. That's what. Just spend your money. Wise up, folks. It's not worth it. But don't worry. It's going to stop because we're going to run. No, we'll never run out of Federal Reserve notes, but we're going to run out of value of the Federal Reserve notes, and this is going to change. And matter of fact, so much what I see today is already the early stages of running out of wealth.
What's next is the collapse, because this whole idea, and I think Coburn captures it well, we spend this much on, and what do we get for it? This stuff doesn't even work. It doesn't work that well. So the charade is coming out in the open. You know, the emperor has no clothes. The money we're spending is not to defend anything. It's simply to enrich the well-connected. I'm going to just read a little bit from this paragraph because I think it's aside from your conclusion, which is the best sentence there, I think this is a very good summation of the point that Coburn is making. If we can put that next clip up. Coburn points out, Pentagon spending this year is projected to nudge $850 billion. The total bill is already way past $1 trillion, but that's another story. Yet, and here's what I underlined, even when endowed with such a gigantic pile of cash, the system is apparently incapable of furnishing the wherewithal for even a limited war, such as the one currently underway in Ukraine. The conflict has been marked by successive announcements that progressively more potent weapon systems are being shipped to the Ukrainians. Javelins, anti-tank missiles, 155mm howitzers, HIMARS, precision long-range missiles, Patriot air defense missiles, Abrams tanks, with F-16 fighters in the offing. A U.S. military intelligence officer pointed out to me recently the actual basis on which these systems are selected. Quote, when we run out of the last system, we're sending. So when they run it out, then they'll send the next one, and the next one, and the next one, and then he goes on to say, so off we go to cluster bombs. Their passage lubricated, we can put the next one on, by crocodile tears from the administration officials. And I put this up because you pointed it out when we had a discussion before the show, Dr. Paul. Quote, I'm not going to stand up here and say it was easy. It's a decision that required a real hard look at the potential harm to civilians, NASA Security Advisor Jake Sullivan told reporters. So he was agonizing over the decision.
Yeah, sure. You know, my habit, I like printed out articles and then I scribble my immediate reaction to it. This one was, as soon as I saw it, it was easy. And I put down, sure, exclamation mark. And then this one is, I get a little harsh here. It's a decision that required a real hard look. I said, that's a lot of BS.
Yes. Yeah.
And I do want to add to that because I think getting together on the internet or at a conference is very, very beneficial because there's no reason why you can't have fun. I tried when I gave longer speeches at times that I would spend most of the time telling young people especially what kind of future they face, and it wasn't glowing. It was up front. There's problems out there. But I always try to say at the end that if we do the right things and they're available to us, these things can be protected. And lo and behold, although I spent most of my time warning them of it, I thought they would be turned off. Oh, you're too negative, too negative. But inevitably, young people would come up and say, you know, I like what you're doing because you're optimistic. And so telling the truth, I think, is what gathers people together and say, that is what makes them optimistic because they're hearing the truth. Bad things are there, but there's an answer to it if we so desire.
Let's move ahead. How does your philosophy translate itself into the world of politics? Now, one of the principal achievements of this country in the past 20 years particularly, I think most people agree, is the gradual growth of social protective legislation based on the principle that we are our brother's keepers. How do you feel about the political trends of the United States, the Western world?
The way everybody feels, except more consciously. I feel that it is terrible, that you see destruction all around you, and that you are moving toward disaster until and unless all those welfare state conceptions have been reversed and rejected. It is precisely these trends which are bringing the world to disaster, because we are now moving towards complete collectivism or socialism, a system under which everybody is enslaved to everybody. And we are moving that way only because of our altruist morality.
Oh, yes, but you say everybody is enslaved to everybody, yet this came about democratically. And free people in a free country voted for this kind of government, wanted this kind of legislation. Do you object to the democratic process?
I object to the idea that people have the right to vote on everything. The traditional American system was a system based on the idea that majority will prevailed only in public or political affairs, and that it was limited by inalienable individual rights. Therefore, I do not believe that a majority can vote a man's life or property or freedom away from him. And therefore, I do not believe that if a majority votes on any issue, that this makes the issue right. It doesn't.
All right, then how do we arrive at action? How should we arrive at action?
By voluntary consent, voluntary cooperation of free men, unforced.
And how do our leaders how do we arrive at our leadership? Who elects? Who appoints?
The whole people elects. There is nothing wrong with the democratic process in politics. We arrive at it the way we arrived by the American Constitution as it used to be. By the constitutional process, as we had it, people elect officials, but the powers of those officials, the powers of government are strictly limited. They will have no right to initiate force or compulsion against any citizen, except a criminal. Those who have initiated force will be punished by force, and that is the only proper function of government. What we would not permit is the government to initiate force against people who have hurt no one, who have not forced anyone. We would not give the government or the majority or any minority the right to take the life or the property of others. That was the original American system.
When you say take the property of others, I imagine that you're talking now about taxes.
Yes, I am.
And you believe that there should be no right by the government to tax. You believe that there should be no such thing as welfare legislation, unemployment compensation, regulation during times of stress, certain kinds of rent controls and things like that.
That's right. I'm opposed to all forms of control. I am for an absolute, laissez-faire, free, unregulated economy. Let me put it briefly. I'm for the separation of state and economics, just as we had separation of state and church, which led to peaceful coexistence among different religions after a period of religious wars. So the same applies to economics. If you separate the government from economics, if you do not regulate production and trade, you will have peaceful cooperation and harmony and justice among men.
You are certainly enough of a political scientist to know that certain movements spring up in reaction to other movements. The labor movement, for instance, certain social welfare legislation. This did not spring full-blown from somebody's head, out of a vacuum. This was a reaction to certain abuses that were going on. Isn't that true, Ian?
Not always. It actually sprang up from the same source as the abuses. If by abuses you mean the legislation, which originally had been established to help industrialists, which was already a breach of complete free enterprise. If then, in reaction, labor leaders get together to initiate legislation to help labor, that is only acting on the same principle, namely, all parties agreeing that it is proper for the state to legislate in favor of one economic group or another. But what I'm saying is that nobody should have the right, neither employers nor employees, to use state compulsion and force.
But when you advocate completely unregulated economic life in which every man works for his own profit, you are asking, in a sense, for a devil-take-the-hindmost, dog-eat-dog society, and one of the main reasons for the growth of government controls was to fight the robber barons, to fight laissez-faire, in which the very people whom you admire the most, the hard-headed industrialists, the successful men, perverted the use of their power. Is that not true?
No, it isn't.
Oh.
This country was made not by robber barons, but by independent men, by industrialists who succeeded on sheer ability.
And
by ability, I mean without political force, help, or compulsion. But at the same time, there were men, industrialists, who did use government power as a club to help them against competitors. They were the original collectivists. Today, the liberals believe that that same compulsion should be used against the industrialists for the sake of workers. But the basic principle there is, should there be any compulsion? And the regulations are creating robber barons. They are creating capitalists with government help, which is the worst of all economic phenomena.
I think that you will agree with me when I say that you do not have a good deal of respect for the society in which you and I currently live. You think that we're going downhill fairly fast. Now, I would like you to think about this question, and you'll have a minute intermission to ponder it and then come back and answer it. Do you predict dictatorship and economic disaster for the United States if we continue on our present course? Do you? And we'll get Ayn Rand's answer in just a moment.
So the Senate on Wednesday overwhelmingly voted down an amendment to the 2024 National Defense Authorization Act that would declare that NATO's Article 5 does not override congressional war powers. And Article 5 is what outlines mutual defense commitments. So the amendment was introduced by Senator Rand Paul, Republican from Kentucky, and it reads, quote, "It is the sense of Congress that Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty does not supersede the constitutional requirements that Congress declare war before the United States engages in war," end quote. So it seems simple enough for people that have, vowed to uphold the Constitution. You would think they would approve this. This is something that should be the case. But no, the amendment failed in a vote of 16 to 83, and it received no support from Democrats, so only Republicans voted in favor. Paul wrote on Twitter after the vote, quote, "It should have been an easy vote to affirm the Constitution. To vote against affirming the Constitution actually places doubt in the Constitution, but it was defeated," end quote. The Senate also voted on an amendment introduced by Senator Tim Kaine, Democrat from Virginia, that requires Senate approval for a president to leave NATO in a vote of 65 to 28. So that amendment passed pretty overwhelmingly. This amendment that, they want to vote on leaving NATO, but they don't want to vote on going to war. No, let's just, jump right into a war if a NATO country gets attacked. So this amendment introduced by Tim Kaine, it reads, quote, "The president shall not suspend, terminate, denounce, or withdraw the United States from the North Atlantic Treaty, except by and with the advice and consent of the Senate, provided that 2/3 of the senators present concur," end quote. All right, the next one here, Russia warns ships against heading to Ukraine. So Russia warned on Wednesday that starting on July 20th, which is Thursday, it would consider all ships in the Black Sea heading to Ukrainian ports as carrying military cargo now that the grain deal has been terminated. So the implication there is that they could be potential targets. The Russian Defense Ministry said, quote, "Given that the Black Sea Initiative has come to an end and the maritime humanitarian corridor has been terminated, all ships going across the Black Sea to Ukrainian ports will be considered potential carriers of military purpose cargoes, starting from 12 a.m. Moscow time on July 20th, end quote. So according to TASS, the ministry said that it would consider the flag states of ships traveling to Ukraine as a party to the conflict. So Zelensky has said that the export of Ukrainian grain through the Black Sea could continue without Russia's participation in the deal, but I would bet that this Russian warning will likely scare shipping companies away. And Russia also announced on Wednesday that it launched a second day of strikes against the Ukrainian Black Sea port city of Odessa. Russia said the missile and drone strikes hit military targets and fuel infrastructure, while Ukrainian officials said the Russian bombardment hit grain infrastructure. Russia ramped up strikes after the Ukrainian attack on the Crimean Bridge, which happened on Monday. So Washington and Moscow are accusing each other of dangerous and unprofessional military activity in Syria. The Kremlin has issued a series of complaints in the past week that American military aircraft were operating in areas used by civilian airliners. Oleg Gurinov, the deputy chief of the Russian Center for Reconciliation on the Opposing Parties, says the American warplanes create a dangerous situation for civilian aircraft. Additionally, Moscow says that American forces stationed at the Al-Tanf garrison, a U.S. military base on the Iraq-Syria border, have used air defenses, further endangering civilian planes. Gurinov said, quote, "Moreover, the coalition's forces carried out exercises involving the use of air defense systems in the Al-Tanf area," end quote. So what he's claiming is that a Russian fighter jet created an unsafe situation for an American spy plane. He reported the incident occurred on Saturday when a U.S. MC-12 conducted operations in support of the coalition's Defeat ISIS mission was closely approached by a Russian Su-35 against established norms and protocols, end quote. He described the Russian fighter jet's actions as creating the dangerous situation for the Americans on board the spy plane. The U.S. plane was forced to fly through its wake turbulence, and this is a manned spy plane, not a drone, because there's been other encounters with drones. And this is, kind of concerning that we keep hearing about this. This is, for a few weeks now, they've been trading accusations because the U.S. presence in Syria is always a potential tripwire for a conflict with Russia. And now that tensions have become so much higher between the two countries, something could really happen over there. And Kyle makes the point that the U.S., Russia is an ally of the Syrian government, and the U.S. is occupying a good chunk of eastern Syria against, the government's wishes. So much for sovereignty. The U.S. doesn't care about sovereignty if it, is in their interest to violate the country's sovereignty. So that is a big difference between the two military presences in the country. All right, the last one here, the House votes to say that Israel is not an apartheid state. So this is from Mondo Weiss, and it's titled "Vast Majority of House Democrats Back GOP Resolution Saying Israel is Not an Apartheid State." So on Tuesday, the House of Representatives overwhelmingly passed a resolution declaring that Israel is not a racist or apartheid state. The final vote was 412 to 9, with one present vote. So the resolution was a GOP effort introduced by Republicans. It was developed as a rebuke to comments made by Representative Pramila Jayapal. She's a Democrat from Washington. I believe she's the head of the Progressive Caucus. She called Israel a racist state while she was addressing Palestine activists. And she has since walked those comments back and claims that she was merely referring to Israel's current right-wing government and not the country overall. She put out a big statement apologizing, just like she did when they issued that letter calling for President Biden to, think about diplomacy with Russia. So the 9 Democrats that voted against the resolution were Rashida Tlaib, AOC, Ilhan Omar, Jamal Bowman, Summer Lee, Cori Bush, Ayanna Presley, Andre Carson, Delia Ramirez, and Belly McCollum. I wish there were some Republicans in there, but they all voted for it. This is a reaction to what Jayapal said, and it also came as Isaac Herzog, the Israeli president, was visiting the U.S. and Biden speaking with Netanyahu. It just goes to show that it's still the vast, vast majority of Congress is all in on supporting Israel. It doesn't matter that they just had that big raid in Jenin, that they've killed over 200 Palestinians this year, that, the judicial overhaul thing, none of that matters. Let's keep giving them that $3.8 billion in military aid each year.
The Peter Schiff Show.
I think the main reason the stock market is rallying, other than just all the hype around AI, some of which is probably not hype, but a lot of it is being excessively priced into the market. But I think it's all the weak economic data that continues to come out, particularly out of the manufacturing side. But I think investors are looking at all this data and concluding that the Fed is done hiking. And even if it's not done, there aren't many hikes left. And the data is so weak that the markets are starting to price in cuts. And it's the expectation of rate cuts that I think is responsible for the market. And I also think investors are concluding that even if the Fed's rate hikes are not enough to reduce inflation, that a recession will do the Fed's job for it. That if we finally get a big downturn in the economy, particularly in the labor markets, that's going to bring the inflation rate down to 2% or lower. And so the markets are, excited about that and starting to price that in. But I think they're completely wrong. I think they're correct in that the economy is weak, but it's not going to reduce inflation. I think if anything, the next recession is a catalyst for a leg higher in inflation, as much larger budget deficits result in even more money printing and a real return in earnest to quantitative easing. In fact, I think that just the widening budget deficits and the explosion in the net interest cost to the government is going to cause the Fed to step up the money printing. So I think it's going to be stagflation. It's going to be a weaker economy, but much stronger inflation. And that is not a positive environment for the markets, particularly a lot of the growth-oriented type tech names. The types of stocks that investors should be buying that are really inflation sensitive are the ones that they're still ignoring. Well, the Fed is not honest. Even if the Fed thought a severe recession was coming, it wouldn't admit that. It would try to put a smiley face on it and hope that positive talk would mitigate the severity of the downturn. But we're going to have a major economic contraction because we have to work off really 20 years of excesses that were the consequence of artificially low interest rates. I mean, the excessive debt and consumption and speculation has come at the expense of serious damage to the underlying structure of the economy. And all this has to be worked out one way or the other. And so it's going to be a very painful process that is going to be elongated by government's efforts to mitigate it and get in the way, because the recession is the market's method of repairing the damage that was done as a result of all the malinvestments and misallocations that were a consequence of the Fed's manipulation of interest rates. But when the government tries to push back against that correction, it just elongates the process and makes it more painful, which is what we've been doing. Every time we start to see a problem, we slash rates and print money. We just saw several large banks fail, and a lot more would have already failed had the Fed not stepped up and backstopped everything. But that doesn't mean we're out of the woods. I mean, all of the problems that resulted in Silicon Valley Bank or Signature Bank or whatever going under, those problems are there throughout the entire banking industry. All you have to do is think about all of the mortgage refinancings that occurred over the last 5 or 6 years, where you've got all these 30-year mortgages in the threes. That's great for the borrowers, but what about the banks that are holding all that paper? They're underwater. They're losing a ton of money on these mortgages. Think about all the commercial mortgages that were extended, where the collateral has collapsed, where commercial real estate values have been halved or down even more than that. So you have all this negative equity in all these loans that the banks are holding on to. Plus, the banks also have large portfolios of government, treasuries, where they own 10 to 30-year maturities, again, where they're collecting 1% and 2% interest in a 5% environment. So they're losing a lot of money on these loans. Meanwhile, everybody is loaded up with debt. Student loans now are getting close to $2 trillion just there. Credit card debt, record territory. Everybody has debt. Corporations just went on a debt binge during the era of cheap money, and their balance sheets are at risk dramatically as all this low yielding debt matures into a higher rate environment. And look at the federal government. I think interest on the national debt right now is $600 to $700 billion a year. That's double where it was about a year ago. By the end of this year, it'll be about $1 trillion. By the end of next year, the U.S. government will be paying $2 trillion a year in interest on the national debt, which will be about $35 trillion by the end of next year, headed for $40 trillion, probably in another year or two from there. And that's if interest rates don't even go up. What if rates keep rising? What if they go to 7% or 8%? So this is a huge debt bomb that's going to explode. And so people are yanking the money out of banks and buying money markets. So they're lending their money to the U.S. government at 5%. And so the banks are losing all their capital in addition to the value of their loans going down. The whole banking sector is completely insolvent, thanks to what we've done over the last decade or so by loading up these banks with all this long-term, low-yielding debt. And we had all these deposit insurance, so nobody really cared about what the banks were doing with their money because it was all insured by the government. But now, though, that people have seen these large banks fail, and the government has said, look, we're not necessarily going to cover your bank if you have more than the FDIC amount. It's a case-by-case situation. We're going to have to evaluate the systemic impact. The message that sends is if you're a customer of a small bank, a regional bank, a community bank, and you've got a large account, you just better get your money out. There's no reason to leave it there. They can't pay you enough interest to compete with a money market. And what if the bank fails? You may be, SOL. And so there's a huge run, on these banks. So they're all going to fail. And the government, obviously, if it wants to bail out every one of these banks, the only way it can do it is by destroying the value of the deposits because of massive inflation, because the money to bail out the banks has to be created by the Fed. That's the only way they're going to get it. The FDIC doesn't have any money compared to the trillions of deposits. And so it doesn't even matter if your bank fails. You're going to lose money if you have a bank account, because either the bank's going to fail because the government doesn't bail it out and you're going to lose your deposits, or the government bails out your bank and your deposits lose their value because inflation destroys the purchasing power. So no matter what happens, people are going to lose a tremendous amount as this banking crisis unfolds.
Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
All right, so in the case of Prospera, you're saying that in principle there could be a Prospera in this or that region of the world. There's a part of the video in which you say that it's less a physical place than it is, I don't know, maybe an approach to government and society. So maybe we should start there. You actually visited the place in Honduras. Now, not that I'm an expert on the geography of Honduras, but where actually in the country is it?
So Prospera, their first location is on an island called Roatan, which is off the coast of Honduras. It's a tourist destination. People go there to go scuba diving or, stay at a resort.
Cruise ships pass through there too.
Cruise ships pass through there a lot. That's right. And so that was appealing to them, they told me, just because it's already got some tourism baked into the infrastructure. There's an airport there that's pretty easy to use from the US. There's direct flights from Miami, for instance. So that is where I went. I had visited Honduras back in 2014 when this was first in the works. The law that authorized these kind of zones, which are known in Honduras as ZERES, this kind of, when you translate it to English, it's more or less zones for economic development. And that passed in 2013. So I first visited the mainland in 2014 to see a couple of sites where they were thinking of building some of these. It was all purely theoretical back then. I even visited Roatan and kind of saw some jungle that later would become what I just visited. So 9 years later, there's actually something to look at, which was an interesting journey for me.
Yeah, so you've had an opportunity to go there, as I said, with Jim, and that was how you were able to make this video. You were able to talk to people. How, though, just going back into the history of it, how does somebody start something like this? What's the process? Do they negotiate with the government of Honduras? I mean, presumably they'd have to.
Well, so what happened was in 2013, the Honduran Honduran Congress passed a law known as the ZERE law, which the context of all this is Honduras is an extremely dangerous country. Back when I visited in 2014, it was actually the largest city there, Tegucigalpa, was the murder capital of the world. It had the highest per capita murder rate. Vast swaths of it are run by narco gangs or were run by narco gangs. The ease of doing business, if you look at rankings, it's always way near the bottom. Kind of contract enforcement is very weak. Rule of law is really bad. And they had just had a very tumultuous change of power where their previous president was more or less ousted by a military coup because he tried to illegally call a referendum to kind of allow his term to be extended. And so because of all that, they were in a sense more open to trying a radical fix because there was this emerging charter city movement. This intellectual economist, Paul Romer, kind of came up with the original idea of the charter cities. And they pitched some influential people there and said, look, instead of endlessly trying to reform this corrupt state you've got going here, what if you just carved out some little zones, granted them some level of autonomy, and then either private companies or the original idea was even it would kind of be overseen by foreign governments could come in and like apply a template that we know works. We know that in Singapore with this set of property rights protections and business regulations and tax code, it creates prosperity. So you could import the Singapore model, you could import the Dubai model, you could import the Canada model, which is where Paul Romer was from. No one went for that version. But that was the idea that was pitched. The Congress that had just booted the former president was more sympathetic to that. The new president who came in was behind it. So it really started gaining a lot of momentum. And Prospera was one of 3 that got approved pretty early on. Then lots of applications flowed in, but for political reasons that we can talk about more, those never got approved. So Prospera is one of the only ones that's actually started to come to fruition at this point.
Can that person just move here? Is there any obstacle to going there any more than there would be to moving to any other part of the physical territory of Honduras?
For them, it's easier than anyone. Anyone from around the world can apply to become part of Prospera Zete. And they have different kind of tiers of membership. They've got what are called e-residents, where you don't actually live there year round, but you're able to visit a certain number of times a year and you pay a certain annual fee to be an e-resident. They have about 600 e-residents so far. And then they've got 200 to 300 workers. Most of those are from Honduras, either people that come from the mainland and work construction jobs, or they've got people who are being remote workers. So we're in the age of remote work now. So there's higher skilled people that companies have set up remote offices there in Prospera because it's advantageous to them. And local Hondurans are going into the office in Prospera, working for a Canadian company, and then going home. And the native Hondurans, they get a discount. So it's about $1,300 for an outsider. That's the annual fee to be part of Prospera. Native Hondurans, it's about an 80% discount. So it's about $250, $260 to join. And anyone who wants to can opt in. That's the entire idea behind the whole premise, is that it's all voluntary opt-in and opt-out.
Let's say I'm somebody who lives in Honduras. I'm familiar with the society and I want to make a change. How is my life improved by this new free city or whatever we might call it?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because that is the entire point of the Congress authorizing this. Was it was sold as a way to improve the lives of a country where not just poverty, but extreme poverty is rampant. And I saw a lot of that firsthand when I was there. The thing about a place like Roatan, you go there as a tourist and if you stay on the resort, you don't really understand what's going on. But if you wander outside of that a little bit, people are living in places, it's dirt floors, it's no running water, it's just extremely primitive stuff. There's a fishing village adjacent to Prospera. And Jim and I went and visited some of the neighbors, both on Roatan, and then they've opened another site right across the sea there on the mainland. And most of the people we talked to said they're bringing jobs. We like them. There's one community there where there's a little bit of tension because some of the political leaders there are afraid that the ZA is going to expropriate their land, like eminent domain them, basically. And I totally understand where their fears are coming from, because they live in a country where the government is constantly expropriating land. So there's that anxiety there, especially among the more, I'd say, like politically aware, politically active people. But most of the just kind of normal people living there, they all seemed happy because they look over there and they see jobs being created. They see a 14-story tower being built, the tallest on the island. They see things getting done in a country where there's a lot of red tape, there's a lot of corruption that stops things from getting done.
Well, here's one of the key.
I'm interested in this idea because it's a peaceful way to carve out a little bit of liberty, a little autonomous zone where the decision-making truly is made on a voluntary basis. But the reason it's never been tried, I guess, is that there's always the bigger government with all the guns who can come in and take it. So that's why I think this is so high stakes. What happens to Prospera one way or another is kind of like, it's a proving ground for, can we try this? Like, if this can work in a place like Honduras, maybe it's actually easier to work other places. There's ideas to do it here in the United States. If it doesn't work, that might be, strangling the baby in the cradle.
On an article in Zero Hedge, it says Biden DOD lets transgender service members skip deployments. Just say, will receive indefinite physical fitness waivers. Well, if they don't want to go to war today, we'll do it tomorrow. But that'd be a good idea. Yeah, really. And many other things, and we'll probably even go over the list of crazy stuff to go on. So we'll go back to the question, why do they do these kind of things? Can this benefit the military? Can it benefit society? Can it promote liberty? And all these kind of things. So a memo came out just recently, and it's the reason it has come up. It's been around for a while, but nobody saw it. It was, but it wasn't classified, but they sort of kept it secret. Yeah. But the dossier has acquired a new Department of Defense DOD memo that goes into great detail. It's a memo, 34 pages on these details on what kind of social conditioning you have to do and you have to change. And I guess they have the muscle to enforce it. I was thinking, maybe if you're thinking about going in, you might not join. And there's a few less people not joining. Yeah. But what if you've been in for 23 years and you were going for 25? Yeah. Boy, I tell you what, it's just like in corporate industry. Why they don't take chances and be annoyed, and because they can lose benefits, lose their job, be canceled, and all that kind of stuff. So there's always this intimidation and force, and this is what's going on here now. The military is in trouble, recruitment is in trouble, our foreign policy is in shambles, and yet they come along here, and it looks like they want to put the nail in the coffin.
Meet the same standards that men do. They should be able to do it if they want to join the Marine Corps, and that seemed fine. Then it was, we've got to lower the standards a little bit because obviously there are some differences between men and women, and that was basically remove standards altogether. There's no standards. If you want to get in, get in. And here's some of the things that Jordan, and I tried to read the 35-page memo. It was very long, written in kind of legislative language. But thankfully, Jordan did the heavy lifting for us, and here's what he found out in his analysis of this 35-page memo. If we can put the next one on. Jordan writes, and here's some of the highlights found within the document. Taxpayer-funded care, that means free for them, and you pay, for transgender service members includes, here's what they get for free: speech and voice therapy, cross-sex hormones, laser hair removal, voice feminization surgery, facial contouring, body contouring, breast and chest surgery, genital mutilation surgery, psychological counseling. Well, I understand that one. And let's go to the next one because there's more. But wait, there's more. And this is the part that's actually even more important, I think. Service members who identify as transgender may receive a waiver for grooming and uniform standards. Okay. Service members who identify as transgender may receive an indefinite waiver for physical fitness standards. This waiver often becomes a de facto permanent situation, and the transgender identifying service member just has to renew the exemption every 6 months. And here's one that really got me, Dr. Paul. Number 4, service members who identify as transgender will be considered non-deployable for up to 300 days while taking hormones for their transition period. Again, given that these hormones are often required for life, this may render the transgender identifying service member as permanently unable to deploy. So we're going to have a military filled up with people who are permanently exempt from going to fight. That doesn't sound like such a great idea to me.
So this is something that I think it's really major, and I think you said that this is one of the big ones of all this mess that you read, and boy, I'd have to agree with that. This is big. This might be the nail in the coffin of the purpose of the military, and I don't know, it's a struggle to find anything good about it, because this is an extension of a philosophy that's encroaching. It's sort of secondary to all this wokeism at home and post-genderism and all this stuff. So this is a mess that I think is not going to go away until the people decide they've had enough. And maybe it's existing already. Maybe the fact that nobody wants to go anymore. Yeah. Maybe it's already started, and that's great. But what we did the other day is express, well, what would the consequence be? How do these people think? Well, we have a draft, and slavery has never been really banned in this country if you happen to be 18 years old and they need you to become a cannon fodder someplace around the world. So no, they enslave people, and that to me is a bad situation. I don't think that the founders intended a military.
Big makeup brand faces boycott calls for using bearded man in lipstick ads. So this was the Amazon Prime days, and they used an influencer to sell, if you can put the next one on, Maybelline. They brought him on board to sell their lipstick and lip gloss and all kinds of other stuff that ladies put usually on their face. And this is from the Daily Caller's right up on it. Maybelline taps bearded man to sell lip gloss, is how they put it. And the whole thing is now there's calls for boycott, as if they hadn't learned from Bud Light, from Disney, from Target. They just keep doing it.
See, I wasn't smart enough to figure out that they were selling lipstick to women. I thought they were selling lipsticks to this 1% transgender people. But anyway, it's back to what I said on our previous issue, in that the end is near. When you see this stuff, something is crazy is going on, and it's values. It has to do with a higher law. It has to do with decency. And what is the goal? And the only thing that I have been able to get into my brain that sounds logical is they have stated in the past about cultural Marxism and Marxism that they can't become Marxists now because there's too many people know the secret of incentives and merit. The idea of merit has come up, and they're talking more about it. They can't stand that, so they can't repair that or systematically remove it. They got to just destroy it, and then when the chaos comes, they're going to move in. But that is something that isn't a conspiracy theory. That's actually written there. Marx talks about it, and they were always looking to destroy the society, and they would rebuild it, and that's how they could get rid of all these people who have incentives to making profits and taking care of themselves.
I have to say, and I'm not a huge fan of modern country music. I like classic country music, Johnny Cash and Texas swing. But anyway, this is a big star. Put this up. This isn't the same thing. Basically the subtitle of "Go Woke, Go Broke." Put this next one on. This is really, I read about this yesterday. It's really big on Twitter right now and yesterday. This fellow's name is Jason Aldean. He's a country music star, modern country. Quote, most contemptible song of the decade. Country music TV bans Jason Aldean's Try That in a Small Town video. And they did it after huge pressure from the usual media elites. Put the next one on. Here's what happened. Here's how his music was reviewed. Variety's Chris Wellman exclaims in a story titled, Jason Aldean already had the most contemptible country song of the decade. This video is worse. He said, Aldean's Try That in a Small Town is close to being the most cynical song ever written. And the Daily Beast published one of its most high-profile criticisms of the song with the title, Jason Aldean Catches Heat for Racist Pro-Gun Lyrics. A modern lynching song is what they called it. And so let's skip the next one and let's go to the next one, because I read that and I thought, wow, this is pretty heavy duty. What's this guy going on about? This has got to be some really heavy stuff. Go to the next one if you can. Here's the lyrics, and I'm not going to read them all. But basically, sucker punch somebody on a sidewalk, carjack an old lady at a red light, pull a gun on the owner of a liquor store. You think it's cool? Well, act a fool if you like. Cuss out a cop, spit in his face, stomp on the flag and light it up. Yeah, you think you're tough? Well, try that in a small town. See how far you make it down the road. And I thought, okay, that reminds me of Lake Jackson and basically every town in Brazoria County, and I can see it's got a little bit of that redneck feel to it, and people here are proud of that. The other lyric that I didn't put on because it was too long, because it basically said, they say they want to come for our guns. Well, that might fly in the big city, but it won't fly down here, that sort of thing. So when I read all the hype about it being a lynching song, I expected a little bit more than something I would hear literally at any coffee shop here in the area.
See, we should be encouraged, no matter what subject it is, it has something to do with peace or freedom and prosperity and all. But it doesn't seem to work that way. But for these people who have the loudest speaker right now, they have the bully pulpit, and they call this the most contemptible song of the decade. Now, I don't follow any of this, but I am really interested in it now. Yeah. I might even like the music. I don't know. I'll go look at it. But it's over the top again. It's too far gone, and I think they hurt themselves. I think what they do is they destroy their credibility, and they no longer will be viable. Pretty soon they'll say, well, we got a good one now. This will do it because we hate a couple people, and we just found out there's going to be 2 indictments today against Trump, and we got to go after him. This sort of thing, just over and over. They lose all credibility, and not only do they lose the credibility, sometimes what they're saying backfires. Like I was kidding. Maybe this will increase people. I got to go get that song. Yeah. But it's really, it's easy for me to look at some of this stuff and divide it into 2 categories, good and evil, and all variations on both sides.
He said, Try That in a Small Town, according to Aldean, is rooted in nostalgia for the tight-knit community he grew up in. where people cared for their neighbors regardless of their background or beliefs. That's just kind of how it sounded to me as well. But the crazy thing is, and actually the reason why this is a good news story, is that they tried to cancel him. They took him off country music television, and he's still #1 on the country charts, #1.
Yeah.
So they helped him.
That got my attention when he was talking about in the community he grew up in. Of course, I think about where I grew up. And a lot of the conversation by the adults had to do with the Depression. I was very young, but they talked about it for a long time. But it was also, the war issue. So those kind of things generally back then, they brought communities together.
Yeah.
That's not it, because they were more justifiable or something. But the atmosphere, the moral atmosphere was so different. It tended to bring communities together. But now it doesn't do that. It's just, this is another opportunity for the blast them. But the results are what really count. So if he's still selling records and still don't want to listen to him, that sounds good to me.
About this today, I didn't realize that Turley wrote about it, and I'm really happy he did, because he puts his unique spin on it. He says, I don't love every one of those lyrics, but, and let's put this next one up. Here's his main point. He says, advocacy groups are now taking credit for country music television canceling Jason Aldean's song. These critics are tone deaf to the implications of such censorship, given our long history of protest songs, as I discuss in today's column. And if you go to the next one, this is from his column. He says, country music singer Jason Aldean's hit single, Try That in a Small Town, secured 2 distinctions this week. It hit #1 in the country charts, and it was pulled by country music television. And he goes on, putting aside CMT's effort to become the Bud Light of music networks, the decision to yield to the intense cancel campaign is an abandonment of the principles of artistic freedom and free speech. Great Turley there. Yeah.
Not complicated either.
Yeah.
I mean, it isn't anything like they describe it, because the end of times are here, because they're in charge of the children from day one. This whole thing that people can't take care of themselves morally, independently. They can't care for their retirements. It just the government has rescued a lot of people. There's a couple of side effects. Sometimes the people don't quite make it, and they end up on the street. And there's a few people are living on the street these days. So that's why that baffles me sometimes. I think we in the freedom movement have such an astounding philosophy on what it is like to have individual liberty and have rules of nonviolence, no aggression, and how successful it's been. There's no evidence to show that this authoritarian stuff, this stuff that you're hearing in Washington, you do this, and we have to take care of people. And if you don't, you're the immoral person. Yeah. So if you don't go along with this, if you don't go along with this idea that 2% of the people can dictate what they want by taking away some liberties of the 98%, and that you're the bigot. Yeah. And they've been able to handle that and convince people of that. And of course, that involves social media and a lot of other things. But it really boils down to individuals deciding which side of this they're on, whether they even think of, what is this higher law? You mean people are supposed to know what's right and wrong? Oh no, that's stupid. We gave up on that, just like we gave up on the Constitution a long time ago. You don't want to have the Constitution. That might invite you to think what right and wrong is.
And now back to our story. All right, Ayn Rand, what I'd like to know is this. Since you describe it as happening in your novel Atlas Shrugged, do you actually predict dictatorship and economic disaster for the United States?
If the present collectivist trend continues, if the present anti-reason philosophy continues, yes, that is the way the country is going. But I do not believe in historical determinism, and I do not believe that people have to go that way. Men have the free will to choose and to think. If they change their thinking, we do not have to go into dictatorship.
Yes, but how can you expect to reverse this trend when, as we've said, the country is run by majority rule through ballot, and that majority seems to prefer to vote for this modified welfare state?
Oh, I don't believe that. You know as well as I do that the majority today has no choice.
What do you mean?
The majority has never been offered a choice between controls and freedom.
How do you account for the fact that an almost overwhelming majority of the people who are regarded as our leading intellectuals and our leading industrialists, the men whom you seem to admire the most, the men with the muscle and the money, favor the modified capitalism that we have today?
Because it is an intellectual issue. Since they all believe in collectivism, they do favor it. But the majority of the people has never been given a choice. You know that both parties today are for socialism, in effect, for controls, and there is no party. There are no voices to offer an actual pro-capitalist, let's say fair, economic freedom and individualism. That is what this country needs today.
Isn't it possible that we all believe in it because we are all basically lonely people and we all understand that we are basically our brother's keepers?
you couldn't say that you really understand it, because there is no way in which you could justify it. Nobody has ever given a reason why men should be their brother's keepers, and you've had every example, and you see the examples around you of men perishing by the attempt to be their brother's keepers.
You have no faith in anything.
Faith?
Only
No.
in your mind.
That is not faith. That is a conviction. Yes, I have no faith at all. I only hold convictions.
Ukraine begins firing U.S. cluster bombs. So Ukrainian officials told the Washington Post on Thursday that Ukrainian forces have started firing U.S.-provided cluster munitions at Russian soldiers in southeastern Ukraine, and this was later confirmed by the White House. So last year, the White House called the use of cluster bombs in Ukraine a potential war crime, but President Biden signed off on the delivery of the civilian-killing munitions earlier this month. As I've covered it quite a bit, cluster bombs are so hazardous to civilians because they spread small submunitions over large areas, and the submunitions that don't explode immediately on impact can kill or maim civilians for decades to come. We're still seeing that in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. In some of those countries, they say it'll take 100 years to clean them all up. So according to the Washington Post, by sending the bombs to Ukraine, President Biden bypassed U.S. law that prohibits the production, use, or transfer of cluster munitions with a dud rate of more than 1%. The dud rate refers to the percentage of these submunitions, or bomblets as they call them, that don't explode. So the Pentagon is claiming that the munitions they are sending to Ukraine have a dud rate of 2.35%, which is higher than 1%. However, that's probably not true. The New York Times reported that the rate will likely be 14%. It could even be higher. Basically, what they're saying is that the Pentagon tests don't take into account the conditions on the battlefield. You know, if the ground is soft, they're less likely to explode, things like that, factors like that. Next one here, Congress sets up a battle over Taiwan military aid. So the House and the Senate are set up for a fight over how much military aid to include for Taiwan in 2024 spending bills, as each chamber's appropriations committees granted a different amount. So the Senate Appropriations Committee on Thursday passed its 2024 State Department and foreign aid spending bill that includes $113 million in foreign military financing grants for Taiwan. The House Appropriations Committee's version of the bill includes $500 million in foreign military financing, FMF grants for Taiwan. So that's a few $100 million more that the Republican-led House is trying to give Taiwan. And FMF is a State Department program that gives foreign governments money to buy U.S.-made arms. The 2023 National Defense Authorization Act included $2 billion in FMF for Taiwan, but congressional appropriators only approved the funds as loans that needed to be paid back. So this gets a little confusing. So the 2023 NDAA is the one that they passed and signed last year. And, you know, they put $2 billion for Taiwan in there, but then when it came to appropriations, which actually, you know, makes the funds available to fulfill the NDAA, the appropriators only put that in as loans, which is because they were worried about cutting the State Department budget in other areas. And as far as I know, those loans haven't been used. I haven't seen any announcements from the State Department that they were loaning Taiwan money to buy weapons. But this, you know, what they're trying to put in for next year is, you know, grants that they're going to give to Taiwan. All right, the next one here, the House kills effort to end emergency war powers. So this article is from Alexander Rubinstein over at the Gray Zone. And it says that in a massive show of support for limitless executive power, Congress rejected legislation that would have terminated national emergency powers, allowing Washington to wage war across the Middle East and to test biological weapons on U.S. citizens. Well, that doesn't sound good. So this was led by Representative Paul Gosar. I believe he's a Republican from Arizona. A handful of Republican members of Congress launched a protest against 41 nominal national emergency declarations, many of which are decades old. So Rep. Gosar has argued that the National Emergencies Act is tyrannical, granting 148 separate powers to the executive branch. On July 18th, which was Tuesday, the House voted down 5 resolutions to terminate national emergency powers, which date back as far as 2003. So they voted on these emergency powers that affect Congo, Yemen, Libya, Syria, and Iraq. Each vote saw a coalition of pro-war Democrats and Republicans join together in overwhelming numbers to protect the executive branch's emergency authorities. I believe only a few dozen Republicans voted to get rid of these emergency declarations. And these things allow the U.S. to sanction countries. These specific examples, there's one to sanction Syria that started in 2004, one to sanction the Democratic Republic of Congo. And there's also this emergency act on Libya, and it's on the basis that Muammar Gaddafi poses a threat to the U.S., and he's long dead, but they still renew these emergency powers these emergency, resolutions, whatever they call them, using Gaddafi as the reason. U.S. launches airstrike in Somalia, says 5 killed. So U.S. Africa Command on Thursday said that it launched an airstrike in Somalia in support of the Mogadishu-based government forces who were engaged with al-Shabaab on the ground. So AFRICOM said the strike was launched in a remote area about 9 miles south of the village of Galkad in Somalia's central Galgudud region, near the border of the Middle Shabelle region. The area is about 150 miles northeast of Mogadishu, so it's like lower central Somalia. So the AFRICOM claimed that its initial assessment found the strike killed 5 al-Shabaab fighters and claimed that no civilians were harmed. We always have to keep in mind that the Pentagon is notorious for undercounting civilian casualties. AFRICOM did not say what day the strike was launched, but the Mogadishu-based government said that its ground forces, the Somali National Army, launched a joint military operation with the U.S. in the same area on Wednesday. The Somali Information Ministry claimed that 100 al-Shabaab fighters were killed in the fighting. And it's not clear if there was U.S. troops on the ground involved in this. There's, as far as we know, 500 U.S. troops. Although when Congress was debating Gates' resolution to withdraw from Somalia, they were saying there's 900 troops there. So President Joe Biden has admonished Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to cease his attempts to ram through his coalition's controversial judicial overhaul amid mass opposition protests. He recommends instead that the Israeli leader seek a broad consensus. Following a meeting with Israeli President Isaac Herzog, Biden told New York Times columnist Thomas Friedman that if a more democratic path is not taken, Washington's special relationship with Tel Aviv could be affected. So while still facing a corruption trial since coming to power last December, Netanyahu's coalition, made up of Likud, far-right, and ultra-Orthodox parties, has attempted to give the Knesset the power to override the Israeli Supreme Court decisions with a simple majority vote. The plan also calls for de facto control regarding court nominees. I believe Netanyahu has said that he might be willing to get rid of the, overriding the Knesset simple majority, overriding the Supreme Court decisions.
Here's Gerald Salenti with today's trends in the news.
So now the dollar is only strong because interest rates are high. When interest rates go down, the dollar goes down. And it's going to be the beginning of the death of the dollar because the BRICS and other countries not involved with them but want to get in with the whole deal, they're tired of America's economic and geopolitical hegemony. So they're going to be going for gold, backed by gold. So the lower the dollar goes, the higher gold prices go because the other currencies get strong and gold is dollar based. So as the dollar gets weaker, it costs them less dough to buy more gold. And already you're seeing what the central banks are buying it up. In the first quarter, it was 155% bigger than last year's, and last year's quarter at the same time. And for last year, it was the biggest ever in central banks buying gold. So that's what you're looking at. Again, the numbers are here. The World Trade Organization, the World Health Organization. Who are they? A bunch of fucking scumbags. That's who they are. They called it a pandemic on March 11th. Look it up. 2020, when out of 114 countries, there are about 8 billion people in the world. 114 countries, the grand total, 4,291 deaths of COVID. And these deaths are now being reported as they didn't die of COVID. So if you take a third of that away, with 30%, yeah. And they called it a pandemic, and people are still calling it a pandemic. So going back to this article, Canada is currently grappling with significant economic issues, market concentration, a select few corporations dominate key sectors, leading to reduced competition, rising prices, and limited purchase options for consumers. Yeah, no shit. It's been going on for fucking how long? And they make the state here. Canada's grocery industry is a prime example. A recent report from Competition Bureau found that a lack of competition in grocery sector is resulting in higher food prices. Grocery industry is dominated by 5 major players: Loblaws, Metro, Empire, Walmart, and Costco. These 5 companies account for over 3/4 of all food sales in Canada. On to the Ukraine war. As you know, the Ukrainians blew up the Crimea Bridge again. In retaliation, the Russians increased their attack into Ukraine. But this is the headline of the toilet paper record, the New York Slime. Russia strikes Ukraine port as grain deal is suspended. Didn't have a fucking thing to do with the grain deal, because then you read down into the article. Explosions thundered over Odessa, Ukraine, as Russia targeted it with missiles and drones before dawn on Tuesday, a day after the apparent Ukrainian strike damage to an important Russian bridge. Yeah. Oh, And the Kremlin halted a deal for safe passage of grain. No. Blowing up the bridge. But that gives you the propaganda, and that's what we don't do. We give you the facts and give you our analysis and our trend forecasts. Hey, how about this for stupidity? How about this for fucking stupid fucking shit that morons and imbeciles swallow? UK Foreign Secretary warns the West, quote, not to drop the ball in Ukraine war. Yep, not to drop the ball. Hey, ballers, go over there and fucking fight or shut your fucking mouth. We've got to respond that if we drop the ball on this, if we allow Putin to win, the pain that we're experiencing at the moment economically will pale into insignificance. James stupidly cleverly, told the Wall Street Journal. Buried into the article, it said that the official number of COVID-19 deaths is probably an exaggeration. This is a quote, because it includes some people who had the virus when they died, even though it was not the underlying cause of death. No fucking shit. No fucking shit. Only been saying this for over 3 years. But now the New York Times and the CDC admitted to it, and even that number is low. Yep. Dumb enough to believe Bush's war. Dumb enough to believe the COVID war. An admission that COVID deaths were overcounted by 30%, according to the CDC. And Fauci, that little fraud, that arrogant little fuckface Fauci, told NBC in 2020, quote, there is absolutely no evidence that that's the case at all, when he was asked about the suggestion that the death toll was being artificially padded. Meanwhile, motorcycle crash victims, gunshot victims, and other unrelated deaths were found to have added to the total. Italy recalculated its own COVID mortality figures in 2021, revealing that just 2.9% of the pandemic deaths could be exclusively attributed to the virus. The remainder had at least one chronic disease, often several, though fact checkers were quick to counter any claims that these comorbidities, not the virus, were responsible for the patient's demise. And it goes on. So again, bullshit. That's all they sell. Today's front page of the Wall Street Journal. America is becoming a nation of early birds. Dinner parties at 5 p.m. Consumers of all ages are sliding activities back. The damage the COVID war has done is incalculable. Again, when I was a kid, they used to have these ads. It's 10 p.m. Do you know where your children are? We're out all the time. Where were you? And now, 10 o'clock, the streets are dead. This thing has changed people so dramatically. Anyway.
Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
And I think we've all kind of had a sense that this was a problem because, of course, we've heard things about Social Security is going to become a problem and Medicare is going to become a problem. There are going to be huge expenses and bills coming due. But one of the reasons that these programs are not sustainable is not just that they're going to be big bills. It's that there are going to be fewer people to pay the bills. That's really the issue. So I realize that the numbers are different in different parts of the world, but try to give us some kind of a sense of the scope of the problem. Because I think qualitatively, people understand that maybe there's been some kind of demographic shift in terms of births, but they may not know exactly the full scope of what we're looking at here.
Yeah, so in terms of, we could talk in depth about the economic consequences of this, but just in terms of the raw numbers and the consequences it's going to have on demographics, Korea right now has a 0.78 total fertility rate, meaning that under current conditions, if those conditions were to hold throughout a woman's lifetime, the number of kids she would end up having is 0.78, so less than one child per woman. And the way that cashes out from a generational perspective is that for every 100 living Koreans, there will be 6 great-grandchildren, which is, that's not comparable to the smallpox epidemics in the New World. It's not comparable to the Black Death. It's the most dramatic and drastic population collapse maybe in human history. And it's going to happen over 3 generations. That's Korea. Japan is a little bit ahead of them. I think their fertility rate is like 1 point something. It's very, very low. And so that means maybe 9 or 10 great-grandchildren. Europe and the US are very similar in terms of their native-born population. They're helped economically, I guess that's debatable, but they're helped in terms of the statistics by migration. And so we are all in this situation where, and it's worldwide, and in the West, it's the most mature and it's the most intense at this moment. But if you look at the drift of fertility rates across the world, including Africa, including Latin America, including India and Pakistan, all these places that we think of as like very, very populous, very, very fertile, all of their TFRs, all of their fertility rates are dropping like a rock, to the point that by 2030, the only region of the world that will have positive population growth on Earth is sub-Saharan Africa. And by the end of this century, they will have fallen below replacement fertility as well. So you can look at it from the cultural and personal perspective. It's just millions and millions of people who will be deprived of this very fundamental human experience. But from an economic perspective, the consequences are going to be absolutely devastating. I mean, you look at Detroit and what essentially happened to Detroit. You could talk about the reasons why everybody abandoned Detroit. That's a broader sort of policy conversation. But like ultimately, the way Detroit collapsed was the tax base abandoned it. The tax base left. And so you had just tens of thousands of vacant homes that had been abandoned. You had people scattered across this sort of wasteland, and like abandoned homes don't keep. They fall apart and they get mold and they get stripped for the copper and the aluminum. And so even the people who chose to stay, the value of their homes collapsed, partly because they were surrounded by urban and suburban blight, but also because all of our homes and our 401ks and Social Security and Medicare, all of the models that give us the sense of like what your home is worth, what your 401k is worth, those are all predicated on reliable economic growth, including population growth. And I'll stop in just a second, but like there's only two ways an economy can grow, right? You can get more efficient, more productive per worker, or you can get more workers. And currently we're in a situation where productivity per worker is growing. It's sort of leveling off, tapering, stagnating, but the number of workers is about to drop like a rock. And so if these circumstances continue, if this demographic collapse transpires the way it looks like it's going to, you will not be able to count on reliable economic growth anywhere in the Western world. So the US, I think, is at 1.6, 1.7 TFR, which is not replacement. That's a declining population.
Now, is replacement 2.1?
2.1 is replacement. And it's not only declining in terms of absolute numbers, it's declining in terms of its aging. And as a population ages, it's not just that there are more dependents, it's that the dependents per person become more costly. Massive healthcare expenses and living expenses. And so what will transpire by the end of the century is that for every working age family, every working age couple trying to raise kids and iterate and build, there are going to be 4 adult dependents, which currently the ratio is inverted. For every working age family, there's 1 adult dependent in the system. And so it's not a problem that like, oh, the population will get smaller. Like a lot of people compare this to wildlife populations. Say, the population crashes and then it sort of rebuilds. It's like, there's probably some point at which it equilibrates, but we have no idea where that is, because the harder it gets to have children and the more that burden falls on a smaller cohort, the harder it will be for that smaller cohort to sort of clear the economic hurdles that are required to start a family. So this thing is on a positive feedback loop. It's getting worse as it gets worse. And yeah, to directly address the immigration question, it's like Mexico's below replacement fertility. Guatemala is just at replacement fertility and dropping like a rock. All of Latin America by 2030 will be below replacement fertility. And immigrants inside the US, their fertility rate is 2.0. So almost at sustainable levels, but not at replacement. And so I've said the problem with socialism is you run out of other people's money. The problem with this is you run out of other people's kids. That's sort of the policy band-aid that every sort of polite, right-thinking Western government has proposed. Like, well, we'll just bring in new people. And it's like, even if you stipulate that you like don't care about the Americans who live here and like you don't value them any differently than you value anybody else, which that's not my perspective. But even if that's the case, that will not solve this economic problem. Kinds of things that we're going to be looking for. Also, infrastructure failure. Like we saw in Detroit with the water in Flint, Michigan. A lot of that is just the fact that the number of people to maintain the machines, and I don't mean like water treatment experts necessarily, although that's part of it. I mean the tax base, the young working population that pays the bills for the infrastructure. As that dwindled, there just wasn't the budget to maintain, because you're pumping water, you're pumping sewer, you're pumping electricity through this city that used to be enormous, and you're pumping it to like one guy on this street and one family on that street, and it stops making economic sense. And so the value of those properties collapses. People's retirement, the majority of middle-class families, they have like 70% of their net worth in their homes. And as those values collapse, it's sort of not a simple thing to be middle-aged or elderly and to have to leave your home and to have that home be like worth nothing, essentially, to be wiped out, especially as people increasingly have these homes on long mortgages with high interest rates. Yeah, so it's essentially, you're looking at a really serious economic problem where probably Gen X is going to be the first that gets hit with this, where Social Security becomes insolvent, reliable economic growth has collapsed, meaning that home values in a lot of states will also have collapsed. 401ks will have fallen quite a lot. And it's like, what do you do at that point? It's not obvious there's a ton you can do. It's just people becoming dramatically poorer in our lifetime.
I just don't agree with your facts, which began with the presentation of one of the most outrageously persistent lies that I hear, which is this private jet. We don't own a private jet. I don't own a private jet. I personally have never owned a private jet. And obviously, it's pretty stupid to talk about coming in a private jet from the State Department up here. Just honestly, if that's where you want to go there.
A few moments later. You just testified under oath that you never owned a private jet. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to enter into the record article here from February 15th, 2023. The John Kerry family private jet was sold shortly after accusations of climate hypocrisy. Mr. Secretary, do you stand by that testimony that you've never owned or
I personally,
your family?
your family? Personally, yes. My wife owned a plane.
It's not just the double standard, I think, is what is at the heart of it. On top of that, it's the fact that you have these people who are like a person like John Kerry is just so, what an ability to just completely be a cold-blooded liar. You know, to look at you right in the eyes and go, this is just an outrageous lie that I've never owned a private jet. I don't own a private jet. I didn't fly on a private jet. I don't know what you're talking about. And you're like, but it says here that your family owns a private jet. He goes, yeah, my wife owns a private jet. Sure. But like that, I don't know. That's her thing. Yeah. Have I flown on my wife's private jet? Sure. Lots of times. But it's like, wait, what? You know, this kind of double standard of where, it's right at the heart of the whole climate change insanity is, oh, look, the climate change is such a disaster that we have to tackle this. Now, what do we have to do in order to tackle this? Well, every single policy prescription is that the little guy's got to suffer. Every policy prescription is like, we have to have a tax on gasoline. We have to ban the car that you like to drive. We have to ban the stove that you like to cook on. You can't drink out of a plastic straw anymore. You got to drink out of a paper straw.
You have to buy credits for what was free from me now. Yes. If you want to consume air, you're now going to have to purchase it from me. I'm the only person you can purchase it from. And unless you're purchasing what used to be free from me, we can't continue as a species.
Yeah, you may not be able to have a hamburger anymore. You may not be, like, every single proposal is something that's going to make the average working class guy's life harder. And meanwhile, they're not even, look, even if you're saying, let's say it's John Kerry's wife, and she's the one flying around. Well, hey, shouldn't you be like putting some pressure on your wife to not be flying private? I thought carbon emissions are like your big issue that you care so much about. No. They don't need to do any of that. It's the same thing as like these socialists who are multimillionaires, you know, want to talk about how awful income inequality is, but they have no interest in like just doing something where they could actually close the gap in terms of income inequality and affect some real person's life by giving them a bunch of your money. They don't know that we don't want to do that. And this is true on so many different issues across the board. So many issues. Of course, this was on full display during COVID, where you would see all of these people, whether it's Nancy Pelosi or Dianne Feinstein or Gavin Newsom or any of them who are the advocates of everyone's got to mask up. But then we all see pictures of you not masking up. Oh, you can't have dinner indoors, but then you're having dinner indoors. You know, at AOC, what was it, at that gala event where she's literally sitting there and they're all not in a mask and all the servants are in masks? You know, it's just this like constant thing. And it's pervasive throughout so many policies. You know, it's like the people who live in gated communities will explain to you why you don't need a wall between Mexico and the United States of America. The people with armed security will tell you why we need gun control. You know, it's like over and over and over again. They literally, they advocate policies that destroy public schools while they send their own kids to private schools. So it's constantly advocating these policies that you will suffer from, that they are completely immune to because they're outside of the system of these policies. Like, it doesn't apply to them. So they're constantly demanding that you sacrifice. But not only that, if you don't agree that you should suffer while they are above these policies that they push, they demonize you in the most vicious ways. You know, if you're like, hey, I think we should build a wall because we can't just have hundreds of thousands of migrants crossing over the border every month. They're like, whoa, you're a horrific racist. And let me go back to my Beverly Hills mansion in a gated community. If while they have armed security around them, if you're like, well, I think I have a right to have whatever weapon I want to protect me and my family, they're like, oh, I guess you just don't care when kids get shot up in a school. You know, like at every turn, you're demonized in the most vicious way for opposing the thing that they don't suffer at all. They don't suffer. The parents who go down to yell at the school board officials because they're like propagandizing their children in public school, they get called terrorists by the parents of people who send their kids to private schools. Like, it's really, it's unbelievable. It's a powerful plan for the elites. It much in the same way that COVID was. It's, they really enjoy these enemies being things that are very untangible, like abstractions, if your enemy.
Sorry, hold on. That's an error. I was trying to look something up.
No problem.
You're good. You're good.
If your enemy is, let's say, the German military or something like that, well, then there can at least be a strategy to defeat this very tangible thing. Okay, well, here's what we're going to do. We're going to have an offensive from this angle. We're going to have, missiles drop over here. We're going to have an air campaign. Okay, you could take them out and then declare victory and then be done. And this is a major part of the reason why after 9/11, we didn't just go to war with Al-Qaeda or go to war with even Iraq or the Taliban. We went to war with terror because that war can go on forever. That's like a blank check to just, you give me all the money and power for whatever I say is the next thing. This is why they love, wars on inequality. Isn't that nice? Inequality. If people aren't equal, we're against it. Well, you're going to have a lot of battles to fight in that campaign.
Now the gimmick we want to talk about is BlackRock. BlackRock is big time business, and that's Larry Fink's little pet project. And he's been around a while. Back in 1986, he was involved in investments. And he didn't do so well back then. Back then, when a dollar was a real dollar, he lost $100 million in a year. So he was never perfect in his investments. And yet he was selected, I believe, and endorsed by the officials and the deep state to manage money for the big guys, for the governments, state governments, and big corporations and all. And he became the largest in the world. He probably is close to it now. $10 trillion he's been able to manage. This is pretty amazing. But I feared that from the very beginning because he was promising to invest in ESG, environment, social, and governmental activities to appeal to the progressives and be morally correct on how your investment goes. And they had ways of threatening people if they didn't do it. So it was a coercive measure. And I thought there's enough malinvestment to go around just with the artificial interest rates we have at business and consumer trying to figure out what to do with a guide from the interest rates. Well, they did big, but there was news. Of course, Chris has looked at this, and that is this past week there was some news coming out that maybe BlackRock is not doing so well. But there's been hints of that all along. The system was flawed from the beginning. But I think this week, Chris, there's been a few things that indicates that they might be in serious trouble, and you combine that with the already built-in malinvestment from inflating the currency and all the things that we've done in the last 10 years. That's why I think the bubble is big and the bubble is bursting. Chris.
Yes, Dr. Paul, it is good news. We're talking about the market, how the market cannot be defeated. It cannot be overpowered in the long term. Now, what exactly is the market? Well, it's very simple. It's billions and billions of individual decisions that we each make every single day at all moments. Like right now, we always choose. I value this over this. I value this over this. Right now, I value speaking to our audience more than anything else I could be doing right now. And this is what 7 billion people do all the time. We're constantly, I value this more than $10. I value $10 more than this. So that's what the market is. That's why it's so powerful and cannot be overturned. But there are always the few that have a problem with this. They say, no, you're going to value what I tell you to value. And that's the authoritarians, all the utopians, all the busybodies, the central planners. And they try to manipulate the market. And they can distort the market, they can manipulate it, but it's always temporary. It's always a fool's errand because in the end, the market always overpowers them. It smashes their schemes. And this has been done throughout all time by kings, by oligarchies, by democracies, by totalitarians. They all try to say, no, you're going to value what we say you're going to value. And they're always doomed to failure. So that's, BlackRock is just yet another example. They came up with this ESG scheme, this environmental, social, and governance, and now they're backtracking. They even put an oil guy, the Saudi oil CEO, on their board. And they said that, what Ron DeSantis did in Florida by pulling their money out of BlackRock and all the decisions that have been made by these, by people boycotting these woke corporations. This is all an agenda that's trying to be pushed into a market, and the market is saying, no, So finally, BlackRock is now starting to at least, go backwards. I'm sure they're still committed to their scheme, but the market is overpowering them and will win in the end, because our economy is filled with political malinvestments. And, you can even tell by the way that they think, by 2050, everybody's going to be driving electric car. I mean, this is how you try to force your ideas on everyone. Anybody can make predictions about 2050. That's so far away that it's ridiculous, but that's how they get their PR, and they push this stuff and they push it. So it's going to have to be liquidated, and that's not going to be fun. And the government's going to blame all the wrong people. They're not going to blame themselves. So everybody has to be alert. It's not going to be who they blame. It's not the greedy businessman who's raising prices. It's the Fed that printed all the money and the government that spent all the money that they didn't have. And now it's going to be time to pay the piper.
They always have to make it sound good to get people to go along, then scare people. In national security or viruses are coming, scare the people so that they capitulate. They might not have a good feeling about it, but it is serious and we can't defy our government. And they do roll over and go along exactly with what they tell you. In medicine, it's safety. That's why you have to get these shots. Now the evidence is coming out. That's not a very healthy thing to have done, to give the shots to as many people. And now if you even go and look at the statistics now showing of the damage done by the inoculations and how risky it was, I mean, it's still a serious crime. In a way, people saying for challenging science, challenging Dr. Fauci, this kind of nonsense. Now, on this investment, it used the issue of virtue, because you're a virtuous person if you were even including in your investments to do what was right for saving the planet, taking on climate control. And this is the way to do it. You can invest the money and make a lot of money. A lot of people made a lot of money because they realized how powerful the forces were. And the punishment was that if you didn't go along, you could get your business in big trouble. So it was a pragmatic business decision then, and probably less so now, where they had to do it because they didn't want this punishment. But it was always a virtuous thing, and you were supposed to feel good about it because you were saving the planet. But that's why we have to be always aware of what they're telling us. And to me, it's the eternal effort to seek out the truth from fiction. And this is a big problem, and it seems to be at the worst that I ever remember. And we certainly are hearing what's going on in the campaign at the present time, that people have a real job figuring out who's telling the truth and who's lying. What TV station can you contribute? Or maybe you should use the internet and some special sources of information as the best way to find out what's going on. Chris?
Very good, Dr. Paul. I will finish up with my closing statement. And it's something that I've mentioned on the show before, but it's so important that I'm going to repeat myself. The U.S. government is the biggest polluter on earth via the military empire. Now there's people who say, no, it's China, it's China. Whatever. If it's China and then the U.S. military, that's not the point. The point is our government. Think about that. The government is the biggest polluter on the earth, or second, whatever. And they are not changing that. And when we're so saturated with environmental propaganda, do you get that sense when you hear the propaganda that it's the government itself? No, they say it's you. It's your plastic straws. It's your plastic bags that you use. You're the problem. You're the CO2 person, and so do you see, they're the big polluter, yet they come after us and try to micromanage our lives with their, agenda. And they have no, this is another important point, they have no inclination of changing this. Have you seen bases changed? Have you seen the war stop? Have the troops come home? If there was a crisis and they're the biggest polluter with the military, shouldn't the troops be coming home? We only have a few years to live. Bring them all home. No, it's the opposite. They think they're going to fight Russia and China at the same time and defend every country that goes along with, with America. So they obviously do not believe their own propaganda because their actions signify that they don't believe the propaganda. So why should we believe it? Why should we have to alter our lives and have carbon scores when they're the problem and not us? So it's important for everybody to keep this in mind, because the propaganda hits us every single day, from the television to the movies to everybody, to all the protesters that want no oil. It's all goofy stuff, and we have to keep an eye that they're the ones that are the problem and not us.
Wow. What happens is the debt gets liquidated and the economy gets weak, and it's forced upon us, which is the kind of thing that should be avoided. But once you develop this huge bubble, they say that Larry Fink has had a true change of heart on what he's doing. Just changing it. If you have $10 trillion you're dealing with, you say, oh, sorry, folks, we missed the boat. We'll come back and do this later. A lot of ramifications from that. But that is the unwinding of the mistakes made and the debt. The debt is not going to be paid off in a moral, sensible way. It will be by the market, by just saying it'll be paid off by money with so much less value through the debasement of the currency. So I think recognizing that and recognizing that the solution is not difficult, it's easily understood, it doesn't have to be prolonged for years. What we're doing now, tinkering around the edges, makes it last longer and longer and more serious. But when you allow the correction to come, and the people who literally have to get out of this with a declaration of debt, I mean, have they really solved the problem of student loans, even with the hundreds of billions of dollars that they have to default on to a degree, and it's a back and forth? It's going to linger for a long time. But sound money and personal liberty and a free market economy, I'll tell you what, could go a long way to solving the problems that we have today. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today, and please return to the Liberty Report soon.
Who are you, Ayn Rand? When I say that, I would like to know just a little bit of your vital statistics. You have an accent which is...
Russian.
Russian. You were born in Russia?
Yes.
Came here?
Oh, about 30 years ago.
And whence did this philosophy of yours come?
Out of my own mind, with the sole acknowledgement of a debt to Aristotle, who is the only philosopher that ever influenced me. I devised the rest of my philosophy myself.
Your parents, did they die in Russia, or did they come here to the United States?
No, I came here alone, and I don't know. I have no way of finding out whether they died or not.
You are married?
Yes.
Your husband, is he an industrialist?
No, he's an artist. His name is Frank O'Connor.
And he, not the writer? He
no,
paints.
not the writer.
And does he live from his painting?
He's just beginning to study painting. He was a designer before.
Is he supported in his efforts by the state?
Most certainly not.
He's supported by you for the time being?
No, by his own work, actually, in the past.
Well, I know.
By me, if necessary, but that isn't quite necessary.
And there is no contradiction here in that you help him.
No, because you see, I am in love with him selfishly. It is to my own interest to help him if he ever needed it. I would not call that a sacrifice because I take selfish pleasure in it.
Let me put one specific case to you. Suppose under your system of self-sufficiency, one single corporation were to get a stranglehold on a vital product or a raw material, uranium, for instance, which might be vital for the national defense, and then would refuse to sell it to the government. Then what?
Under a free system, no one could acquire a monopoly on anything. If you look at economics and economic history, you will discover that all monopolies have been established with government help, with the help of franchises, subsidies, or any kind of government privileges. In free competition, no one could corner the market on a needed product.
Let's say there is a deposit.
History will support me.
There is a deposit of uranium in Nevada. It's the only one in the United States, and that's our only access to that. And for self-defense, we need this. Whereas, let's say, in the Soviet Union, the state is able to command that. And a kind of a strange man of strange beliefs got hold of this uranium and said, I will not sell this uranium to my government. He should not be able to be forced by the government, according to your philosophy, to sell that uranium.
But you realize that you are setting up an impossible fantasy. That is, if you're talking of any natural resource that is vitally needed, it could not become vitally needed if it were that scarce. Not scarce to the point where one man could control all of it. So long as, I'm using your example, if a natural resource exists in more than one place in the world, no one man is going to control it.
All right, let's take another. How do we build roads, sanitation facilities, hospitals, schools? If the government is not permitted to force, if you will, by vote, taxation, use your word, we have to depend upon the trickle-down theory, upon the noblesse oblige, the largesse.
I will answer you by asking you a question. Who pays for all those things?
All of us pay for these things.
When you admit that you want to take money by force from someone and ask me how are we going to build hospitals or roads, you admit that someone is producing the money, the wealth, that will make those roads possible. Now you have no right to tell the man who produced the wealth in what way you want him to spend it. If you need his money, you can obtain it only by his voluntary consent.
And you believe in the eventual goodwill of all human beings, or at least that top echelon of human beings, whom you believe will give willingly.
No goodwill is necessary, only self-interest. I believe in private roads, private post offices, private schools.
When industry breaks down momentarily, and there is unemployment, mass unemployment, we should not be permitted to get unemployment insurance. Social security we do not need. Will depend upon the self-interest of these enlightened industrialists whom you so admire to take care of things when the economy needs a little lubrication and there are millions of people out of work.
Study economics. A free economy will not break down. All depressions are caused by government interference. And the cure is always offered so far to take more of the poisons that cause the disaster. Depressions are not a result of a free economy.
And one last question. We only have about a half a minute. How many Randists, you don't like the word, I beg your pardon.
Objectivists.
How many objectivists would you say there are in the United States?
It's hard to estimate, but I can tell you some figures. My best intellectual, Nathaniel Brandon, a young psychologist, is giving a series of lectures on my philosophy in New York. He has received 600 letters of inquiry within the month of January. He's giving these lectures, and the attendance is growing in geometrical proportion.
Ein, I'm sure that you have stimulated a good many people, more people than already have, to read your book, Atlas Shrugged, and The Fountainhead. And I'm equally sure they will be stimulated for the reading, indeed, if they do not agree.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.